Good morning. I got a call about Walking Dead, so I'm jumping right in. He's supposed to be Prophet now. That's supposed to be his account, but I guess he's running two now. That's normal. Yeah.
Prisoner. Agonizing situation of Marguerite, Queen of Louis. 30,000 Crusaders massacred or taken into slavery. Religious resignation of Louis. He enters into an abject treaty for his ransom. Revolt of the Mamluks. Death of Al-Modin. Oktai, chief of the Mamluks. The emirs of Egypt. Chedridor elected Sultana of Egypt. And Est-Anabic the governor. Extinction of the Evite dynasty. Damietta delivered up to the Mussulmans. Ransom paid for Louis. Consternation in France on hearing of his capture. He arrives at Ptolemais, deliberates with his knights as to their future operations. The Syrians refuse to acknowledge the authority of the Mamluks. Civil commotions in Egypt. Chedridor marries Est-Seddon and yields her regal authority. Death of Frederick II. Of Germany, Conrad, his successor, excommunicated. Jacob of Hungary pastors Pope Innocent IV. Urges the preaching of fresh crusade. Singular message of the old man of the mountain to Louis. A visit to his court. Cities of Palestine fortified by Louis. War between the sultans of Cairo and Damascus. Treaty between them, and hostilities resumed against the Christians. The Turkmen surprise Sidon and slaughter the inhabitants. Belenaz pillaged by the Crusaders. Pious devotedness of Louis. He fortifies Sidon. Death of Blanche, Queen Regent of France. Louis quits Palestine and arrives at Paris. Excellence of Jondel's history on the character and misfortunes of Louis. Damietta destroyed by the Mussulmans, and the mouth of the Nile filled with stones. Rise and fall of the Mamluks. Hospital of Quinsphinx. The Tartars and Moguls. The sizes of Jerusalem. Characters of Frederick II. Of Germany and Pope Innocent IV. Fatal Crusade events excellent of Romano pages 393 to 493. B. 1. History. 11. The Crusades. Book 9. Fourth Crusade. AD 1195 to 1198. When we cast a retrospective glance over the periods we have described, we congratulate ourselves upon not having lived in those times of war and trouble. But when we look around us, and reflect upon the age of which we form a part, we fear we have little reason to boast over the epochs commonly termed barbarous. During 25 years a revolution, born of opinions unknown to past ages, has pervaded cities, agitated nations, and shaken thrones. This revolution has for auxiliary war and victory. It strengthens itself with all the obstacles that are opposed to it. It is forever born again from itself, and when we believe we can perceive the end of its ravages, it reappears more terrible and menacing than ever. At the moment in which I resume the account of the Crusades, 1. The spirit of sedition and revolt, the fanaticism of modern doctrines, which seem to slumber. 2. All at once awake, and again threaten the world with universal disorder. Nations which tremble for their liberty and their lusts, are aroused, and spring up in arms. A coalition of all kings and of all nations, a general crusade is formed not to defend the tomb of Christ, but to preserve that which you are possessed of in ancient civilization. It is amidst the rumors of a new revolution, of a formidable war, that I am about to describe the revolutions and wars that disturbed the East and the West in the Middle Ages. May I, whilst deploring the calamities of my country, profit by the events of which I am a witness, and by the frightful spectacle which is before my eyes, to paint with greater truth the passions and the troubles of a remote age, and revive in the hearts of my contemporaries a love of concord and peace. The death of Saladin was followed by that which almost always is to be observed in the dynasties of the East, a reign of agitation and trouble succeeding a reign of strength and absolute power. In these dynasties, which have no other support but victory, and the all-powerful will of a single man, as long as the sovereign, surrounded by his soldiers, commands, he is tremblingly obeyed. But as soon as he has closed his eyes, his people precipitate themselves towards license with the same ardor that they had yielded to servitude. And passions, long restrained by the presence of the despot, only blaze forth with a greater violence when there remains nothing of them but a vain remembrance. Saladin gave no directions respecting the order of succession, and by this want of foresight prepared the ruin of his empire. One of his sons, Al-Aziz, too, who commanded in Egypt, caused himself to be proclaimed Sultan of Cairo. Another 3 took possession of the sovereignty of Aleppo, and a third of the principality of Hamath. 4. Malik Adel, the brother of Saladin, assumed the throne of Mesopotamia and the countries in the neighborhood of the Euphrates. 3. The principal emirs, and all the princes of the race of the Ayyubites, made themselves masters of the cities and provinces of which they held the command. 5. Afdhal, 6, eldest son of Saladin, was proclaimed Sultan of Damascus, master of Syria, and of the capital of a vast empire, sovereign of Jerusalem and Palestine. 7. He appeared to have preserved something of the power of his father. But all fell into disorder and confusion. The emirs, the old companions of the victories of Saladin, endured with reluctance the authority of the young sultan. Several refused to take the oath of obedience, 8, drawn up by the cadis of Damascus. 4. Others consented to take it, but on condition that their fiefs should be secured to them, or that new ones should be bestowed upon them. Far from laboring to reduce the power of this haughty soldiery, Afdhal neglected the duties of his throne for the pleasures of debauchery, to which he gave himself up entirely, abandoning the welfare of his empire to a vizier, 9, who rendered him odious to the Muslims. The army demanded the dismissal of the vizier, whom they accused of having usurped the authority of the prince. The vizier, on his part, advised his master to banish the seditious emirs. The weak sultan, who only saw with the eyes of his minister, annoyed by the presence and complaints of a discontented army, dismissed from his service a great number of soldiers and emirs, who went among all the neighboring princes, complaining of his ingratitude, and accusing him of forgetting, in the bosom of idleness and effeminacy, the holy laws of the Prophet and the glory of Saladin. The greater number of them, who went into Egypt, exhorted Al-Aziz to take arms against his brother. The Sultan of Cairo gave ear to their advice, and under the pretense of avenging the glory of his father, conceived the project of possessing himself of Damascus. He assembled his forces, and marched into Syria at the head of an army. At the approach of danger, Afdhal invoked assistance from the princes that reigned over the countries of Hamath and Aleppo. Soon a formidable war blazed forth, into which was dragged the whole of the family of the Ayyubites. Al-Aziz laid siege to Damascus. The hopes of an easy conquest animated his emirs, and made them believe that they were fighting in a just cause. But if they at first had but little success, and as victory seemed every day to fly further from their banners, the war began to appear to them unjust. At first they murmured. Then they revolted from Al-Aziz, and at length rejoined the troops of Syria. The Sultan of Cairo, upon being thus abandoned, was obliged to raise the siege disgracefully, and return into Egypt. The sultans of Damascus and Aleppo pursued him across the desert, with the design of attacking him in his capital. Afdhal, at the head of a victorious army, soon carried terror to the banks of the Nile. Al-Aziz was about to be dethroned, and Egypt to be conquered by the Syrians, if the brother of Saladin, guided by a policy, whose motive might be easily defined, had not opposed the authority of his councils to the arms of the conqueror, and re-established peace in the family of the Ayyubites. The princes and emirs respected the experience of Malik Adel, and allowed him to be the arbitrator of their differences. The warriors of Syria and Egypt, accustomed to see him in camp, looked upon him as their leader, and followed him with joy to battle. Lost nations, that he had often astonished by his exploits, invoked his name in their reverses and dangers. The Mussulmans now perceived with surprise that he had been in a manner exiled in Mesopotamia, and that an empire, founded by his velour, was abandoned to young princes who bore no name among warriors. He himself grew secretly indignant at not having received due recompense for his labors, and was aware of all that the old soldiers, he had so often led to victory, might one day do to further his ambitious views. It was important to his designs that too much of the empire should not be in the same hands, and that the provinces should remain for some time longer shared by two rival powers. The peace which he had brought about could not be of long duration. 6, and the discord ever on the point of breaking out among his nephews, must soon offer him an opportunity of reaping the rich harvest of the vast heritage of Saladin. AFDHAL, warned by the dangers he had run, resolved to change his conduct. Hitherto he had scandalized all faithful Muslims by his intemperance in the use of wine. Abu Fida, who was descended from the family of Saladin, 10, says, in his history, that the Sultan of Damascus, during the early years of his reign, passed his life amidst banquets and indulgence, taking delight in nothing but listening to songs and composing verses. On his return from Egypt, AFDHAL exhibited an entire alteration in his manners. But he only fell from one excess into another. He was now constantly at prayers, or employed in the most minute practices of the Muslim religion. But, in his excessive devotion, as in his dissipated life, he was perfectly inattentive to the duties of the monarch, and submitted himself, without reserve, to the counsels of the same vizier who had already nearly cost him his dominions. Then, says Abu Fida, complaints against him were heard from all quarters, and tongues that had been loud in his praise became silent. Al-Aziz thought this opportunity favorable for again taking up arms against his brother. And Malik Adel, persuaded that war was most likely to minister to his ambition, no longer advocated peace, but placed himself at the head of the army of Egypt. Having intimidated by his threats, or won by his presence, the principal emirs of AFDHAL, he at once took possession of Damascus in the name of Al-Aziz, and soon governed as sovereign the richest provinces of Syria. Every day fresh quarrels broke out among the emirs and princes. All those who had fought with Saladin thought the moment was come at which to put forth and establish their pretensions. And the princes who still remained of the family of Nureddin began to entertain hopes of regaining the provinces wrested from the unfortunate Abdik by the son of Il. All the east was in a state of fermentation. 7. Bloody divisions desolated Persia, a prey to the various claims of the people remains of the race of the Seljukites. The empire of the Khwarezmians, which conquest was every day extending, threatened at the same time the capital of Khorasan and the city of Baghdad, in which the pontiff of the Muslim religion lived in perpetual fear. For a long time the caliphs had been unable to take any active part in the events that changed the face of Syria. And the only authority they possessed was exercised in consecrating the victories of the triumphant party, whoever that might be. AFDHAL, driven from Damascus, called in vain upon the Caliph of Baghdad for protection. All that shadow of power could afford him was a recommendation to exercise patience, and an assurance that his enemies would have to render an account to God of what they had done. Among the rivalries that convulsed the Muslim states, Malik Adel met with no obstruction to his projects. The troubles and disorders which his usurpation gave birth to, even the wars undertaken against him, all contributed to the consolidation and extension of his unjustly obtained power. It became evident that he must soon unite under his sway the greater part of the provinces conquered by Saladin. This was verified, for the second time within a few years, the observation of an Arabian historian, who expressed himself in the following words when speaking of the succession of Nureddin: the greater part of the founders of empires have not been able to leave them to their posterity. This instability of power is not a thing to be wondered at in countries where success renders everything legitimate, where the caprices of fortune are frequently laws, and where the most formidable enemies of an empire founded by arms are the very men whose bravery has assisted in raising it. The historian we have quoted deplored the revolutions of military despotism without only searching for the natural causes of them, and can explain so many changes only by referring to the justice of God, always ready to punish, at least in their children, all who have employed violence or shed the blood of man to attain empire. Such were the revolutions which, during many years, agitated the Muslim states of Syria and Egypt. The Fourth Crusade, which we are about to describe, and in which the Christians might have greatly profited by the troubles of the East, only served to reunite the scattered members of the empire of Saladin. Malik Adel owed the progress of his power not only to the divisions of the Muslim League, but to the spirit of discord that reigned among the Christians. After the departure of the King of England, as was always the case at the termination of every crusade, the Christian colonies, surrounded by perils, advanced more rapidly to their fall. Henry of Champagne, charged with the government of Palestine, disdained the title of king, as he was impatient to return to Europe, and looked upon his kingdom as a place of exile. The three military orders, detained in Asia by their vows, constituted the principal strength of a state which but lately had had all the warriors of Europe for its defenders. Gaius Lusignan retired to Cyprus, took no more interest in the fate of Jerusalem, and had full occupation in keeping himself on his new throne, shaken by the continual revolts of the Greeks and threatened by the emperors of Constantinople. Bohemond III, grandson of Raymond of Poitiers, and descended, in the female line, from the celebrated Bohemond, one of the heroes of the First Crusade, governed the Principality of Antioch in the county of Tripoli. Amidst the misfortunes that afflicted the Christian colonies, the sole aim of this prince was the extension of his dominions, and every means appeared to him good and just that could forward his designs. Bohemond pretended to have claims to the Principality of Armenia, and employed by turns force and stratagem to get possession of it. After several useless attempts, he succeeded in decoying into his capital Rupin of the Mountain, one of the princes of Armenia, and detained him prisoner. Levon, the brother of Rupin, determined to take signal vengeance for such an outrage, and, under the pretense of treating for peace, invited Bohemond to repair to the frontiers of Armenia. The two princes engaged by oath to come without escort or train to the place of conference, but each formed a secret design of laying a snare for his adversary. The Armenian prince, better seconded by either his genius or fortune, remained conqueror in this disgraceful contest. Bohemond was surprised, loaded with chains, and carried away to a fortress of Lesser Armenia. 9. The war was instantly renewed with fury. The people of both Armenia and Antioch rushed to arms, and the countries and cities of the two principalities were speedily by turns invaded and ravaged. At length peace became desirable, and after some disputes upon the conditions, the Prince of Antioch was sent back to his states, and Rupin of the Mountain was restored to the nations of Armenia. By an agreement entered into by the two princes, Alice, the daughter of Rupin, married the eldest son of Bohemond. This union promised to be the pledge of a durable peace. But the germ of so many divisions still subsisted. The two parties retained a strong feeling of the outrage they had received, and every treaty of peace becoming a fresh subject of discussion, war was always ready to be rekindled. In another direction, ambition and jealousy set at variance the orders of the Temple and St. John. At the period of the Third Crusade, the Hospitallers and the Templars were as powerful as sovereign princes. They possessed in Asia and Europe villages, cities, and even provinces. 11. The two orders, rivaling each other in power and glory, attended far less to the defense of the holy places than to the augmentation of their own renown and riches. Every one of their immense possessions, every one of their prerogatives, the renown of the knights, the credit of the leaders, all, even to the trophies of their valour, were for them subjects of rivalry, and, at length, this spirit of discord and jealousy produced an open war. A French gentleman, established in Palestine, possessed, as a vassal of the Hospitallers, the castle of Margat, situated towards the frontiers of Arabia. The Templars pretended that this castle belonged to them, and took possession of it by main force. Robert, that was the name of the gentleman, carried his complaints to the Hospitallers, who immediately flew to arms and drove the Templars from the castle. From that time the knights of the two orders never met without provoking each other to the combat, most of the Franks and Christians always taking a part in the quarrel, some for the order of St. John, others for that of the Temple. The King of Jerusalem and the most prudent of the barons made many useless attempts to restore peace, and several Christian princes endeavored in vain to reconcile the two rival orders. The Pope himself had much difficulty in getting a sacred mediation to be accepted, and it was only after long debates that the Holy See, sometimes armed with evangelical thunders, sometimes employing the eternal language of the head of the Church, terminated, by its wisdom and supreme ascendancy, a contest which the knights themselves would have preferred deciding with sword and lance. During these fatal divisions none thought of defending themselves against the general enemy, the Saracens. One of the most melancholy consequences of the spirit of faction is that it always leads to a lamentable indifference for the common cause. The more violently the parties attacked each other, the less perception they seem to have of the dangers that threaten the Christian colonies. Neither the Knights of the Temple or of St. John, nor the Christians of Antioch or Ptolemy ever thought of asking for support against the infidels. and history does not say that one person was sent from the east to make Europe aware of the Greeks of Shin. The situation of the Christians in Palestine was besides so uncertain and perilous that the wisest could form no idea of coming events, or dare to adopt the resolution. If they appealed afresh to the warriors of the West, they broke the truce made with Saladin, and exposed themselves to all the resentment of the infidels. If they respected treaties, the truce might be broken by the Mussulmans, ever ready to profit by the calamities which fell upon the Christians. In this state of things, it appeared difficult to foresee a new crusade, which was neither called for by the wishes of the Christians of Asia, nor promoted by the interests of Europe. In fact, when we cast our eyes over the Christian colonies of the East, as they are described to us in these unhappy times, and see the spirit of ambition and discord displacing in all hearts the Holy Spirit of the Gospel, we cannot wonder that Christendom took so little interest in their fate. Again, when contemporary history represents to us these colonies prey to license and division, and destitute of everything that could render them flourishing, we can scarcely believe that the West was again likely to lavish its wealth and its blood to support and defend them. But the great name of Jerusalem still produced a powerful effect upon the minds of all. The remembrance of the First Crusade still aroused the enthusiasm of Christians, and the veneration for the holy places, which appeared to grow weaker in the kingdom of Christ itself, was yet cherished beyond the seas and in the principal countries of the West. Celestine III had, by his exhortations, encouraged the warriors of the Third Crusade, and, at the age of 90, pursued with zeal all the projects of his predecessors, ardently wishing that the last days of his pontificate should be illustrated by the conquest of Jerusalem. After the return of Richard, the news of the death of Saladin had spread joy throughout the West, and revived the hopes of the Christians. Celestine wrote to all the faithful to inform them that the most formidable enemy of Christendom had ceased to live. And, without regarding the truce made by Richard Coeur de Lion, he ordered his bishops and archbishops to preach a new crusade in their dioceses. 12. The sovereign pontiff promised all who would take the cross the same privileges and the same advantages as in the preceding crusades. The profanation of the holy places, the oppression under which the faithful of the East groaned, the ever-increasing insolence and audacity of the Saracens, such were the motives by which he supported his holy exhortations. He addressed himself particularly to the bishops of England, and commanded them to use every persuasion to induce Richard again to take up arms against the infidels. Richard, although returned, had never laid aside the cross. 12. The symbol of pilgrimage. And it might be supposed he still intended to repair again to the Holy Land, but scarcely escaped from an unjust captivity, taught by his own experience how great were the difficulties and perils of a distant enterprise. His thoughts and time were engrossed by his endeavors to remedy his losses, to defend or aggrandize his states, and to be on his guard against the insidious attempts of Philip Augustus. His knights and barons, whom he himself exhorted to resume the cross, professed, as he did, a warm devotion for the cause of Jerusalem. But they could not make up their minds to return to a country which had been to them a place of suffering and exile. Although the appearance of the preachers of the crusade everywhere inspired respect, they had no better success in France, where, only a few years before, 100,000 warriors had been roused by the summons to defend the holy places. If the fear of the enterprises of Philip was sufficient to detain Richard in the West, the dread of the vindictive and jealous disposition of Richard exercised the same influence over Philip. The greater number of his knights and nobles followed his example, and contented themselves with shedding tears over the fate of Jerusalem. The enthusiasm for the crusade was communicated to only a small number of warriors, amongst whom history names the Count de Montfort, who afterwards conducted the cruel war against the Albigeois. From the commencement of the Crusades, Germany had never ceased to send its warriors to the defense of the Holy Land. It deplored the recent loss of its armies, destroyed or dispersed in Asia Minor, and the death of the Emperor Frederick, who had gained nothing but a grave in the plains of the East. But the remembrance of so great a disaster did not extinguish in all hearts the zeal for the cause of Jerusalem. Henry VI, who occupied the imperial throne, had not partaken, as the kings of France and England had, the perils and reverses of the last expedition. Unpleasant remembrances or fears of his enemies in Europe could have no effect in preventing him from joining in a new enterprise. or deter him from a holy pilgrimage which so many illustrious examples seem to point out as a sacred duty. Although this prince had been excommunicated by the 13th Holy See, only the preceding year, the Pope sent an embassy to him, charged with the duty of recalling to his mind the example of his father Frederick, and urging him to assume the cross. Henry, who sought every occasion to conciliate the head of the church, and who likewise entertained vast projects in which a new crusade might be very serviceable, received the envoy of Celestine with great honors. Of all the princes of the Middle Ages, no one evinced more ambition than Henry VI. His imagination, say historians, was filled with the glory of the Caesars, and he wished to be able to say with Alexander, "All that my desires can embrace belongs to me." Tancred, a natural son of William II, King of Sicily, chosen by the Sicilian nobility to succeed his father, was recently deceased. And the Emperor, who had espoused Constance, the heiress of a throne founded by Norman Crusaders, and desirous of establishing his claims, judged that the time was come to carry out his designs and achieve his conquests. The expedition of which the Holy See desired him to be the leader was exceedingly favorable to his ambitious projects. When, promising to defend Jerusalem, he only thought on the conquest of Sicily. And the conquest of Sicily had no value in his estimation but as opening the road to Greece and Constantinople. 13. At the same time that he professed entire submission to the will of the head of the church, he endeavored to form an alliance with the republics of Genoa and Venice, promising them the spoils of the conquered. But in his mind he nursed the hope that he should one day overthrow the Italian republics and lower the authority of the Holy See, and upon the remaining revive, for himself and his family, the empire of Augustus and Constantine. Such was the prince to whom Celestine sent an embassy, and whom he wished to persuade into a holy war. After having announced his intention of taking the cross, Henry convoked a general diet at Worms, in which he himself exhorted the faithful to take up arms for the defense of the holy places. Since Louis VII, King of France, who 14, harangued his subjects to induce them to join in the crusade, Henry was the only monarch that had mingled his voice with that of the preachers of the Holy War, to make his subjects acquainted with the sufferings and complaints of the Church of Jerusalem. His eloquence, celebrated by the historians of his time, but above all, the spectacle presented of the great emperor himself preaching a holy war against the infidels, made a profound impression upon the multitude of his auditors. 14. After this solemn address, the most illustrious of the prelates assembled at Worms ascended the evangelical pulpit to keep up the rapidly increasing enthusiasm of the faithful. During 8 hours nothing was heard but the groans of Shin and the city of God. Henry, surrounded by his court, assumed the symbol of the Crusaders. A great number of German nobles followed his example, some to please God, and others to please the Emperor. Among those who took the oath to combat the Saracens, his remained Henry Duke of Saxony, Otto Marquis of Brandenburg, Henry Count Palatine of the Rhine, Hermann Landgrave of Thuringia, Henry Duke of Brabant, Albert Count of Habsburg, Adolphus Count of Schweinberg, Henry Count of Pappenheim, Marshal of the Empire, the Duke of Bavaria, Frederick, son of Leopold, Duke of Austria, Conrad Marquis of Moravia, Wilhelm Dellenborg, and the bishops of Würzburg, Bremen, Curtin, Halberstadt, Passau, and Ratisbon. 15. The crusade was preached in all the provinces of Germany, and the letters of the Emperor and the Pope kindled the zeal of the Christian warriors everywhere. Never had an enterprise against the infidels been undertaken under more favorable auspices. As Germany undertook the crusade almost singly, the glory of the German nation seemed as much interested in this war as religion itself. Henry was 15, to command the holy expedition, and the Crusaders, full of confidence and hope, were preparing to follow him to the east. But Henry entertained other views. Several nobles of his court, some who penetrated his secret designs, and others who believed they offered him prudent advice, conjured him to remain in the west, and direct the crusade from the bosom of his dominions. And Henry, after a slight resistance, yielded to their prayers, and gave his whole attention to the hastening of the departure of the Crusaders. The Emperor of Germany placed himself at the head of 40,000 men and took the route for Italy, where everything was prepared for the conquest of Sicily. The remainder of the Crusaders were divided into two armies, which, proceeding by different roads, were to meet in Syria. The first, commanded by the Duke of Saxony and the Duke of Brabant, embarked at ports of the German Ocean and the Baltic. The second crossed the Danube and directed its march towards Constantinople, whence the fleet of the Greek Emperor Isaac was to transport it to Ptolemy. To this army, commanded by the Archbishop of Mainz and Valois-Lemberg, were joined the Hungarians, who accompanied their Queen Margaret, sister to Philip Augustus. The Queen of Hungary, after having lost Bela her husband, had made a vow to live only for Christ, and to end her days in the Holy Land. The Crusaders under the command of the Archbishop of Mainz and Valois-Lemberg were the first to arrive in Palestine. Scarcely were they landed when they expressed their desire and resolution to begin the war against the infidels. The Christians, who were then at peace with the Saracens, hesitated to break the truce signed by Richard, and were, further, unwilling to give the signal for hostilities before they could open the campaign with some hopes of success. Henry of Champagne and the barons of Palestine represented to the German Crusaders the danger to which an imprudent rupture would expose the Christians of the East, and conjured them to wait for the army of the Dukes of Saxony and Brabant. But the Germans, full of confidence in their own strength, were indignant at having obstacles thrown in the way of their leader by vain scruples 16, and chimerical alarms. They were astonished that the Christians of Palestine should thus refuse the assistance sent to them by Providence itself, and added, in a tone of anger and contempt, that warriors of the West were not accustomed to defer the hour of battle, and that the Pope had not induced them to take up arms and the cross to remain in a state of shameful inactivity. The barons and knights of the Holy Land could not listen to such injurious speeches without indignation, and replied to the German Crusaders that they had neither solicited nor wished for their arrival. That they were better acquainted than the northern warriors of Europe with what was advantageous to the kingdom of Jerusalem. That they had without any force braved the greatest perils, and that when the proper moment should arrive they knew how to prove their valor otherwise than by words. Amid such warm debates the minds of both parties became daily more exasperated, and the most cruel discord thus prevailed among the Christians before war was declared against the infidels. All at once the German Crusaders marched out in arms from Ptolemy, and commenced hostilities by ravaging the land of the Saracens. At the first signal of war the Muslims gathered together their forces, and the danger that threatened them putting an end to their discord. From the banks of the Nile and from the remotest parts of Syria crowded hosts of warriors but lately armed against each other, but who now, assembled under the same banners, acknowledged no other enemies but the Christians. Malik Adel, towards whom all Muslims turned their eyes when the defense of Islamism was the question, marched from Damascus at the head of an army and repaired to Jerusalem, where all the emirs of the adjoining provinces came to take his orders. The Muslim army, after dispersing the Christians who had advanced towards the mountains of Nablus, laid siege to Jaffa. In the Third Crusade much importance had been attached to the conservation of the city. Richard Coeur de Lion had fortified it at great expense, and when that prince returned to Europe he left a numerous garrison in it. Of all the maritime places, Jaffa was nearest to the city, which was the object of the wishes of the faithful. If it remained in the hands of the Christians, a road was always open for them to Jerusalem, and the means of laying siege to that place were rendered more easy. But if it fell into the power of the Muslims, it gave them proportional advantages for the defense of the Holy City. When it was known at Ptolemy that the city of Jaffa was threatened, Henry of Champagne, with his barons and knights, immediately took arms to defend it, and joined the German Crusaders, giving all their energies to the prosecution of a war which they found could now no longer be deferred or avoided. The three military orders, with the troops of the kingdom, were about to set forward on their march, when a tragical accident once more plunged the Christians in grief, and retarded the effects of the happy harmony which had been re-established at the approach of peril. Henry of Champagne, leaning against a window of his palace, at which he had placed himself to see his army defile from the city, the window all at once gave way, and in itself precipitated him with it. 16. The unfortunate prince expired in sight of his soldiers, who, instead of following him to battle, accompanied him to his grave, and lost several days in celebrating his funeral obsequies. The Christians of Ptolemy were still waiting for death at their king, when the misfortune they dread increased their grief and consternation. The garrison of Jaffa, having attempted a sortie, had fallen into an ambuscade, and all the warriors that composed it were either killed or taken prisoners. The Mussulmans entered the city almost without resistance, and 20,000 Christians were put to the sword. These disasters had been foreseen by all who had dreaded the breaking of the truce. But the barons and knights of Palestine lost no time in vain regrets, or in the utterance of useless complaints, and looked with eager impatience for the arrival of the Crusaders who had set out from the ports of the ocean and the Baltic. These troops had stopped on the 18 coast of Portugal, where they had defeated the Moors and taken from them the city of Sils. Proud of their triumph over the infidels, they landed at Ptolemy at the moment the people were lamenting the loss of Jaffa and crowding to the churches to implore the mercy of heaven. The arrival of the new Crusaders restored hope and joy to the Christians, and they resolved to lose no time, but to march at once against the infidels. The army left Ptolemy and advanced towards the coast of Syria, whilst a numerous fleet kept alongshore, loaded with provisions and warlike stores. The Crusaders, without seeking the army of Malik Adel, laid siege to Berytus. The city of Berytus, at an equal distance between Jerusalem and Tripoli, by the commodiousness of its port, its large population, and its commerce, had become the rival of Ptolemy and Tyre. The Muslim provinces of Syria acknowledged it as their capital, and it was in Berytus that the emirs, who contended for the lordship of the neighboring cities, came to display the pomp of their coronations. After the taking of Jerusalem, Saladin was here saluted sovereign of the city of God, and crowned sultan of Damascus and Cairo. The pirates, who infested the seas, brought to the city all the spoils of the Christians. The Mussulman warriors there deposited the riches acquired by conquest or brigandage. And the Frank captives, made in late wars, were crowded together in the prisons of Berytus. So that the Christians had powerful motives for endeavoring to get possession of this place, and the Mussulmans had no less urgent ones for defending it. Malik Adel, after having destroyed the fortifications of Jaffa, advanced with his army as far as the mountains of Antalabadis, on the route to Damascus. But on hearing of the march and determination of the Crusaders, he crossed the mountains on his left, and drew near to the coast. The two armies met on the plain watered by the river Eleuthera, between Tyre and Sidon. The trumpets soon sounded to battle. The army of the Saracens, which covered an immense space, endeavored at first to surround the Franks, and then to get between them and the coast. Their cavalry precipitated itself by turns on the flanks, the van, and the rear of the Christians. The Christians closed their battalions 19, and on all sides presented impenetrable ranks. Whilst their enemies showered arrows and darts upon them, their lances and swords were bathed in the blood of the Saracens. They fought with different arms, but with the same bravery and fury. The victory remained for a long time uncertain. The Christians were several times on the point of losing the battle. But their obstinate valor at length triumphed over all the resistance of the Mussulmans, and the seacoast, the banks of the river Eleuthera, and the declivities of the mountains were covered with dead. The Saracens lost a great many of their emirs. Malik Adel, who displayed, during the whole of this day, the skill of a great captain, was wounded on the field of battle, and only owed his safety to flight. All his army was dispersed. Some fled towards Jerusalem, whilst others hurried along the road to Damascus, whither the news of this bloody defeat carried consternation and despair. 17. In consequence of this victory, all the cities on the coast of Syria, which still belonged to the Mussulmans, fell into the power of the Christians. The Saracens abandoned Sidon, Laodicea, and Giblet. When the Christian fleet and army appeared before Berytus, the garrison was surprised, and did not venture to offer any resistance. The city contained, say historians, more provisions than would have sufficed for the inhabitants during 3 years. 2 large vessels, and the same chronicles, could not have contained the bows, arrows, and machines of war that were found in the city of Berytus. In this conquest immense riches fell into the hands of the victors, but the most precious reward of their triumph doubtless was the deliverance of 9,000 captives, impatient to resume their arms, and avenge the outrages of their long captivity. The Prince of Antioch, who had joined the Christian army, sent a dove 18 to his 20 capital to announce to all the inhabitants of the principality the miraculous victory gained by the soldiers of the cross. In all the Christian cities thanks were offered up to the God of armies. The historians, who have transmitted to us the account of these glorious events, in order to paint the transports of the Christian people, content themselves with repeating these words of Holy Writ. Benjamin leaped with joy, and the children of Judah were filled with delight. Whilst the Crusaders were thus pursuing their triumphs in Syria, the Emperor Henry VI took advantage of all the means and all the power that the crusade had placed in his hands to achieve the conquest of the kingdoms of Naples and Sicily. Although, in the course of his victories, he unceasingly invoked religion, humanity, and justice, he only listened to the dictates of his ambition. And, tormented by the sentiment of an implacable revenge, he was neither touched by the misery of the conquered, nor the submission of his enemies. All who had shown any respect or any fidelity for the family of Tancred were cast by his orders into dungeons, or perished in horrible tortures, which he himself had invented. The army he led but too well seconded his gloomy and savage policy. The peace which the conquerors boasted of having restored to the people of Sicily caused them more evils, and made more victims than war itself. Placanus, who died some years before this expedition, had deplored beforehand, in his history, the misfortunes that were about to desolate his country. He already saw the most flourishing cities and the rich country of Sicily laid waste by the eruption of the barbarians. Oh, unfortunate Sicilians, cried he, it would be less frightful for you still to endure the tyrants of old Syracuse than to live under the empire of this savage nation, which advances to invade your territory, and plunge you into all the horrors of misery and slavery. 21:19. Nevertheless, these pitiless soldiers wore the crosses of pilgrims. And their emperor, although not yet relieved from his excommunication, arrogated to himself glory as the first of the soldiers of Christ. Henry VI was considered as the head of the crusade and supreme arbiter of the affairs of the East. The king of Cyprus offered to become his vassal. Levon, prince of Armenia, begged the title of king of him. The emperor of Germany, having no more enemies to dread in the west, gave his whole attention to the war against the Saracens, and in a letter addressed to all the nobles, magistrates, and bishops of his empire, exhorted them to hasten the departure of the Crusaders. The emperor undertook to keep up an army of 50,000 men for 1 year, and promised to pay 30 ounces of gold to everyone that should remain under his banners till the end of the Holy War. A great number of warriors, seduced by this promise, entered into an engagement to cross the sea and fight against the infidels. Henry had no further need of them for his own conquests, and therefore pressed their departure for the east. Conrad, Bishop of 22, Hildesheim, Chancellor of the Empire, whose counsels in the wars of Sicily had but too well aided the ambition and barbarous policy of his master, was charged with the task of leading the Third Army of the Crusaders into Syria. The arrival of so powerful a reinforcement in Palestine rekindled the zeal and enthusiasm of the Christians, and it might be expected that they would signalize their earned funds in great enterprise. The victory they had recently gained in the plains of Tyre, the taking of Berytus, Sidon, and Jignet, had struck the Muslims with terror. Some of the leaders of the Christian army proposed to march against Jerusalem. That city, said they, cannot resist our victorious arms. Her governor is a nephew of Saladin, who endures with impatience the authority of the Sultan of Damascus, and has often appeared disposed to listen to the propositions 20 of the Christians. Most of the barons did not, however, partake in this hope, and placed no confidence in the words of the Muslims. It was well known that the infidels, after the departure of Richard Coeur de Lion, had very considerably augmented the fortifications of Jerusalem. 21. That a triple wall, and ditches of great depth, must render this conquest more perilous, and particularly more difficult, than in the time of Godfrey of Bouillon. Winter was approaching. The Christian army might be overtaken by the rainy season, and forced to raise the siege in face of the army of the Saracens. These considerations determined the Crusaders to put off the attack of the Holy City to the following year. It is not impertinent to remark here that in the Christian armies they were constantly talking about Jerusalem. 23. but that the leaders has constantly directed their efforts and their arms to the acquisition of other conquests. The holy city, situated far from the sea, contained within its walls no other treasures but religious relics and monuments. The maritime cities of Asia could boast of more worldly wealth, and held out far greater advantages to the conquerors. They afforded, likewise, more easy communication with Europe. And if the conquest of Jerusalem sometimes tempted the piety and devotion of the pilgrims, that of cities bordering upon the sea, constantly kept awake the ambition of the maritime and warlike nations of the West. All the sea coast from Antioch to Ascalon belonged to the Christians, the Mussulmans having only been able to keep possession of Thoron. The garrison of this fortress frequently made incursions into the neighboring countries, and by continual hostilities, intercepted the communication between the Christian cities. The Crusaders resolved that before they set out for Jerusalem, they would lay siege to the castle of Thoron. This fortress, built by Hugh St. Omer, in the reign of Baldwin II, was situated at some leagues from Tyre, on the summit of a mountain, between the chain of Libanus and the sea. It was only accessible across steep rocks, and by a narrow way bordered by precipices. The Christian army had no machines sufficiently lofty to reach the heights of the walls, and arrows or stones hurled from the foot of the mountain could not injure the besieged. Whilst beams and fragments of rock precipitated from the ramparts made dreadful havoc among the besiegers. In the early attacks, the Saracens ridiculed the vain efforts of their enemies, and witnessed, almost without danger to themselves, prodigies of valor, and the most murderous inventions of the art of sieges, exercised ineffectually against their walls. But the almost insurmountable difficulties that might have been supposed likely to arrest the progress of the Christians, only redoubled their ardor and courage. 22. They every day made fresh attacks, each day seeming to increase their efforts, and their obstinate bravery was seconded by newly invented machines of war. With incredible labor, 24, they dug out the earth, and made themselves a way across the rocks. Whilst some Saxons, who had worked in the mines of Ramsberg, were employed in opening the flank of the mountain. The Crusaders at length reached the bottom of the ramparts of the fortress. The walls, the foundations of which they demolished, began to shake in various parts, without being struck by the ram, and their fall, which seemed delayed by a miracle, filled the besieged with dread. The Mussulmans, now losing all hope of defending themselves, proposed to capitulate. But such was the disorder of the Christian army, with its multitude of leaders, that not one of them durst take upon himself to listen to the proposals of the infidels. Henry, Palatine of the Rhine, and the Dukes of Saxony and Brabant, who enjoyed great consideration among the Germans, could enforce obedience from none but their own soldiers. Conrad, Chancellor of the Empire, who represented the Emperor of Germany, might have been able to exercise beneficial power. But, weakened by disease, without experience in war, always shut up in his tent, he awaited the issue of the contest, and did not even deign to be present at the councils of the princes and barons. When the besieged had come to the determination to capitulate, they remained several days without knowing to which prince it would be most proper to address themselves, and when their deputies came to the Christian camp, their propositions were heard in a general assembly, in which the spirit of rivalry, short-sighted zeal, and blind enthusiasm held much greater empire than reason and prudence. The Saracens, in their speech, confined themselves to imploring the clemency of their conquerors. They promised to abandon the fort with all their wealth, and only asked life and liberty as the price of their submission. The suppliant attitude of the Saracens must have touched the heart of the Christian warriors. Religion and policy united to procure a favorable answer to the proposals that were made to them, and the greater part of the leaders were disposed to sign the capitulation. But some of the most ardent could not see without indignation that it was wished to obtain by treaty that which they must soon gain by force of arms. It is necessary, said they, that all our enemies should be struck 25, with terror. And if the garrison of this place perish by the sword, the affrighted Saracens will not dare to wait for us either in Jerusalem or the other cities still in their possession. As their advice was not adopted, these ardent and inconsiderate soldiers resolved to employ every means to interrupt the negotiation, and whilst reconducting the deputies to the fortress, said to them, "Defend yourselves, for if you surrender to the Christians, you will all perish in tortures." In addition to this, they addressed the Christian soldiers and informed them, with accents of anger and grief, that a disgraceful peace was about to be concluded with the enemies of Christ. At the same time, such of the leaders as inclined towards peace spread themselves through the camp and represented to the army that it was useless, and perhaps dangerous, to purchase by new contests that which fortune, or rather Providence itself, offered to the Crusaders. Among the Christian warriors, some yielded to the counsels of moderation, others were unwilling to trust to anything but the sword. Such as preferred victory to peace, ran to arms, and they who accepted the capitulation retired to their tents. The camp, in which some remained in inaction and repose, whilst others prepared for battle, presented, at the same time, an image of peace and war, but in this diversity of opinions, amidst as strange a spectacle as the army then presented, it was easy to foresee that they would very soon be unable either to treat with enemies or fight them. The capitulation was, notwithstanding, ratified by the principal chiefs and by the Chancellor of the Empire. The hostages the Saracens were to send were looked for in the camp, and the Crusaders fancied they could see the gates of the castle of Thoron thrown open to them. But despair had all at once changed the resolutions of the Saracens. When the deputies to the Christian camp reported to their companions in arms what they had seen and what they had heard, when they told them of the menaces that had been made to them, and of the divisions that existed among the enemies, the besieged forgot that their walls were in ruins, that they wanted both arms and provisions, that they had to defend themselves against a victorious army. And they swore 26, rather to die than treat with the Crusaders. Instead of sending hostages, they appeared in arms upon the ramparts, and provoked the besiegers to renew the contest. The Christians resumed the labors of the siege, and recommenced their attacks. But their courage grew weaker every day, whilst, in the same proportion, despair seemed to increase the bravery of the Mussulmans. The besieged labored without intermission in repairing their machines and rebuilding their walls. Sometimes the Christians were attacked in the subterranean passages they had dug, and perished, buried under masses of loosened earth, whilst arrows and stones were constantly showered upon them from the ramparts. Frequently the Saracens succeeded in surprising some of their enemies, whom they carried alive into the place, and then slaughtered without mercy. The heads of these unfortunate prisoners were exposed upon the walls, and afterwards hurled by the machines into the camp of the Christians. The Crusaders appear to have sunk into a sort of dejection or apathy. Some still fought and remembered their oaths, but others remained indifferent spectators of the dangers and death of their brethren. Many added the scandal of the most depraved morals to their indifference for the cause of God. There might be seen, says an historian, men who had quitted their wives to follow Christ, forgetting all at once the most sacred duties and attaching themselves to vile prostitutes. In fact, the vices and disorders of the Crusaders were so disgraceful that the authors of the old chronicles blush whilst they retrace the picture of them. Arnold of Lubeck, after having described the corruption that reigned in the camp of the Christians, appears to ask pardon of his reader. And, that he may not be accused of writing a satire, he takes care to add that he does not recall such odious remembrances to confound the pride of men, but to warn sinners, and touch, if possible, the hearts of his brothers in Christ. 23. Fame soon brought to the ears of the Christians that the kingdoms of Aleppo and Damascus were in arms, that Egypt had assembled an army, and that Malik Adel, followed by a 27, numberless multitude of warriors, was advancing by forced marches, impatient to avenge his late defeat. 24. At this news, the leaders of the crusade resolved to raise the siege of Thoron. And to conceal their retreat from the enemy, they did not blush to deceive their own soldiers. On the day of the purification of the Virgin, whilst the Christians were engaged in the offices of devotion, the camp was informed, by sound of trumpet, that it was intended to make a general assault on the morrow. The whole army passed the night in preparations for the fight. But, at break of day, they learned that Conrad and most of the leaders had quitted the army and taken the road to Tyre. The men assembled in groups round their tents to ascertain the truth, and made inquiries of each other with the greatest inquietude. The blackest forebodings took possession of the minds of the Crusaders. As if they had been conquered in a great battle, their only thought was fight. Nothing had been prepared for the retreat, no order had been given. No man saw anything but his own danger, or listened to any advice but that suggested by his fear. Some loaded themselves with everything valuable they possessed, whilst others abandoned even their arms. The sick and wounded dragged themselves along with pain in the steps of their companions. Such as could not walk were abandoned in the camp. The confusion was general. The soldiers marched pell-mell with the baggage. They knew not what route to take, and many lost 28 themselves in the mountains. Nothing was heard but cries and groans, and, as if heaven wished to denote its anger at this disorder, a frightful tempest came on. Fierce lightning rent the clouds, the thunder rolled in awful peals, and torrents of rain inundated the country. 25. In their tumultuous flight, not one of the Crusaders ventured to turn his eyes to that fortress which, but a few days before, had offered to surrender to their arms. Their terror was not abated till they beheld the walls of Tyre. The army being at last reassembled, it became a general inquiry, what was the cause of the disorder they had experienced. Then a new delirium took possession of the Christians. Mistrust and mutual hatred succeeded to the panic terror of which they had been the victims. The most grave suspicions were attached to actions the most simple, and gave an odious meaning to words perfectly innocent. The Crusaders reproached each other, as with wrongs and proofs of treachery, with all the evils they had suffered or feared to suffer. The measures that an improvident zeal had counselled, as well as those that had been dictated by necessity and prudence, were the work of perfidy without example. The holy places, which so lately the Crusaders had contemplated with apparent indifference, now occupied their every thought. And the most fervent reproached the leaders with introducing none but profane views into a holy war, with having sacrificed the cause of God to their own ambition, and with having abandoned the soldiers of Christ to the fury of the Saracens. The same Crusaders proclaimed loudly that God had been unfavorable to the Christians, because those whom he had appointed to lead the defenders of the cross, disdained the conquest of Jerusalem. Our readers may remember that after the siege of Damascus, in the Second Crusade, some Templars and Germans were accused of Papists, and of having sacrificed the zeal and bravery of the Christian warriors. Accusations quite as serious were renewed on this occasion, and with equal bitterness. If we are to believe the old chronicles, Malik Adel had promised several leaders of the Christian army a 29 great number of pieces of gold to engage them to raise the siege of Thoron. And the same chronicles add that when the Mussulman prince paid them a sum agreed, he gave them nothing but false gold, a worthy price of their cupidity and treachery. 26. The Arabian historians give no sanction to these odious accusations. But such was the spirit of animosity which then reigned among the Christian warriors, that they were judged with more severity by their brethren and companions in arms than by their enemies. At length the rage of discord was carried so far that the Germans and the Syrian Christians would not remain under the same colors. The former retired to the city of Jaffa, the ramparts of which they restored, and the latter returned to Ptolemy. Malik Adel, willing to profit by these divisions, marched towards Jaffa, and offered the Germans battle. A severe conflict took place at a short distance from the city. The Duke of Saxony and the Duke of Brabant both perished in the melee. 27. The Crusaders lost a great number of their bravest warriors, but the victory was in their favor. After a triumph which was due to their arms alone, the pride of the Germans knew no bounds, and they treated the Christians of Palestine with the greatest contempt. We have, said they, crossed the seas to defend their country, and, far from taking any part in our labors, these warriors, without either gratitude or courage, abandoned us in the hour of peril. The Christians of Palestine, on their side, reproached the Germans with having come into the east, not 30, to fight but to command. Not to assist their brethren, but to impose a yoke upon them more insupportable than that of the Saracens. The Crusaders, added they, only quitted the west to make a pleasurable military progress into Syria. They there found peace, but they left war behind them. Like those birds of passage that announce the season of storms and tempests. In these fatal divisions nobody had sufficient credit and power to restrain angry spirits, or reconcile discordant opinions. The scepter of Jerusalem was in the hands of a woman. The throne of Godfrey, so often shaken, was destitute of support. The empire of religion and law was every day fading away, and violence alone possessed the privilege of making itself respected. Necessity and force were the only powers that commanded obedience. Whilst the license and corruption that prevailed among the people, still called the people of God, made such frightful progress, that we are tempted to accuse contemporary authors and ocular witnesses of employing great exaggeration in their recitals. In this state of decline, amid such shameful disorders, the most wise and prudent of the prelates and barons thought the best step they could adopt would be to give an able and worthy leader to the Christian colonies, and they entreated Isabella, the widow of Henry of Champagne, to take a new husband, who might consent to be their sovereign. Isabella, by 3 marriages, had already given Palestine 3 kings. They proposed to her Amaury, who had recently succeeded Guy de Lusignan in the kingdom of Cyprus. An Arabian historian says that Amaury was a wise and prudent man, who loved God and respected humanity. He did not fear to reign, amidst war, troubles, and factions, over the poor remains of the unfortunate kingdom of Jerusalem, and came to share with Isabella the vain honors of royalty. Their marriage was celebrated at Ptolemy, with more pomp, say historians, than the posture of affairs warranted. Although this marriage might not remedy all the evils under which the Christians labored, it at least afforded them the consolatory hope that their discords would be appeased, and that the colonies of the Franks, when better governed, might gather some fruit from so many victories gained over the infidels. But news which arrived 31, from the west, soon spread fresh grief through the kingdom, and put an end to the barren exploits of the Holy War. Amidst the festivities which followed the marriage and coronation of Amaury, the death of the Emperor Henry VI was announced. 28. The election of a new head of the empire would most probably produce a violent contest in Germany, and every one of the German princes or nobles then in Palestine naturally turned his attention to that which he had to hope or fear in the events preparing in Europe. They determined to return immediately into the West. The Count de Montfort and several other French knights had but recently arrived in the Holy Land, and earnestly entreated the German princes to defer the return. The Pope likewise, on receiving intelligence of the death of Henry VI, wrote to the leaders of the Crusaders, to implore them to finish their good work, and not to abandon the cause of Christ. But neither the prayers of the Count de Montfort nor the exhortations of the Pope could detain the Germans, impatient to return to their country. Of so many princes who had left the West to secure a triumph to the cause of God, the Queen of Hungary alone was faithful to her vows, and remained with her knights in Palestine. 29. On quitting Syria, the Germans contented themselves with leaving a garrison in Jaffa. A short time after their departure, whilst celebrating the feast of St. Martin with every excess of drunkenness and debauchery, this garrison was surprised and massacred by the Saracens. 30. Winter was 32, approaching. Neither party could keep the field. Discord reigned equally among Christians and Muslims, and both sides were desirous of peace, because they were incapable of carrying on the war. The Count de Montfort concluded with the Saracens a truce for 3 years. Thus terminated this crusade, which only lasted a few months, and was really nothing but a pilgrimage for the warriors of the West. The victories of the Crusaders rendered the Christians masters of all the coasts of Syria. But their precipitate departure destroyed the fruits of their conquests. The cities they had obtained were left without defenders, and almost without inhabitants. This Fourth Crusade, in which all the powers of the West miscarried in an attempt upon a little fortress of Syria, and which presents us with this strange spectacle of a holy war directed by an excommunicated monarch, furnishes the historian with fewer great events and a smaller number of great misfortunes than the preceding expeditions. The Christian armies, which made but a transient visit to the east, experienced neither the famine nor the diseases that had proved so fatal to the former enterprises. The foresight and attention of the Emperor of Germany, who had become master of Sicily, provided for all the wants of the Crusaders, whose exploits were intended to assist his ambitious projects, and whom he considered as his own soldiers. 33. The German warriors that composed the Christian armies had not the requisite qualities to secure the advantages of victory. 31. Always ready to throw themselves blindly into danger, quite ignorant that it is possible to ally prudence with courage, listening to nothing but the violence of their own passions, and recognizing no law but their own will. obedient to leaders of their own nation, and despising all others. Full of an indomitable pride, which made them disdain the help of their allies and the lessons of experience, such men could neither make peace nor war. When we compare these new crusaders with the companions of Richard or Godfrey, we find in them the same ardor for fight, the same indifference for danger. But we find them very deficient in that enthusiasm which animated the first soldiers of the cross at the sight of the holy places. Jerusalem, which had never ceased to be open to the devotion of the faithful, no longer beheld within its walls a crowd of pilgrims which, at the commencement of the holy wars, repaired thither from all parts of the West. The Pope and the leaders of the Christian army forbade crusaders to enter the holy city without having conquered it. And they, who did not always prove so docile, obeyed the prohibition without pain. More than 100,000 warriors that had left Europe for the purpose of delivering Jerusalem, returned to their homes without having entertained perhaps one thought of visiting the tomb of Christ, for which they had taken up arms. The 30 ounces of gold promised by the emperor to all who should cross the sea to fight the infidels, very much increased the number of the crusaders. This was not the case in former expeditions, in which the crowd of soldiers of the cross was influenced principally by religious motives. More religion than politics had entered into the other holy wars. In this crusade, although it had been directly promoted by the head of the church, and was to a considerable extent directed by bishops, we may safely say there was more of politics than religion. Pride, ambition, 34, jealousy, the most disgraceful passions of the human heart, did not make an effort, as in the preceding expeditions, to cover themselves with a religious veil. The Archbishop of Mainz, the Bishop of Hildesheim, with most of the other ecclesiastics who took the cross, attracted no admiration for either their wisdom or piety, or distinguished themselves by any personal quality. Conrad, the Chancellor of the Empire, on his return to Europe, was followed by the suspicions which had been attached to his conduct during the Holy War. And when, a long time after, he was slain by several gentlemen of Würzburg, who conspired against him, the people considered his tragical death as a punishment from heaven. Henry VI, who had preached the crusade, only viewed this distant expedition as a means and an opportunity for increasing his power and extending his empire. Whilst the West put up prayers for the success of a holy war, of which he was the life and soul, he prosecuted an impious war, desolated a Christian people for the purpose of subjecting them to his laws, and threatened the empire of Greece. 32. The son of Tancred was deprived of his sight, and cast into prison, and the daughters of the king of Sicily were carried away into captivity. Henry's barbarities were so excessive, that he irritated his neighbors, and created enemies in his own family. When he died, a report prevailed in Europe that he had been poisoned. The nations that he had rendered miserable could not believe that so many cruelties could remain unpunished, and they asserted that Providence had employed the wife of the emperor to be his executioner, and to avenge all the calamities he had inflicted upon the kingdoms of Naples and Sicily. At the approach of death, Henry remembered that he had persecuted Richard, that he had detained a prince of the Crusaders in chains, in spite of the solicitations of the Father of the Faithful. And he hastened to send ambassadors to the King of 35, England, charged with the task of making him a solemn reparation for so great an outrage. After his death, as he had been excommunicated, it was thought necessary to address the sovereign pontiff to obtain permission to bury him in the Holy Land. And the Pope coolly replied that they were at liberty to bury him among Christians, but before they did so, they must offer up many prayers to mitigate the anger of God. In taking possession of the beautiful and rich territories of Italy by perfidy and violence, Henry prepared for that unfortunate country a series of revolutions to be renewed from age to age. The odious war he had made against the family of Tancred naturally gave birth to other wars injurious to his own family. 33. In removing so far from Germany with his armies, Henry afforded opportunity for the formation of powerful parties, which, at his death, disputed the imperial scepter with some success, and at length gave rise to a war in which the principal states of Europe were involved. Thus, whilst the other holy wars had contributed to maintain or establish public peace in Europe, this Fourth Crusade produced divisions among the states of Christendom without at all diminishing the power of the Saracens, and it only served to introduce trouble and confusion into many kingdoms of the West. 36. Book X. Fifth Crusade.
Conquered.
AD 1198 to 1204. Christian troops, says J.J. Rousseau, in his Contrat Social, are, as they say, excellent. I deny it. Show me such. For my part, I know no Christian troops. The events we have just related, and those we are about to make known, will, there is no doubt, suffice to refute this strange paradox of J.J. Rousseau. The author of the social contract does not dissemble, it is true, the objections that may be made to him from the history of the Crusades. But, ever faithful to his system, and taking no account of historical truths, he answers that the Crusaders, far from being Christians, were citizens of the Church. That they fought for their spiritual country, which the Church had rendered temporal nobody knows how. Strange abuse of reasoning, which confounds the sense of words, and refuses the title of Christians to those who fought in the name of Christ. In representing the Crusaders as citizens of the Church, Rousseau doubtless meant to say that the popes were the origin of the Crusades, and that the soldiers of the cross defended the temporal power of the popes. We at once reply that the Crusades owed their birth and growth to the religious and warlike enthusiasm that animated the nations of the West in the 12th century, and that without this enthusiasm, which was not the work of the heads of the Church, the preachings of the Holy See would not have been able to collect a single army under the banners of the cross. We may further add that, during the Holy Wars, the sovereign pontiffs were frequently driven from Rome and despoiled of their states, and that they did not summon the Crusaders 37 to the defense of the power or temporal country of the Church. Not only were the Crusaders not always the blind instruments of the Holy See, but they sometimes resisted the will of the popes, and yet in their camps were no less models of valor united with Christian piety. No doubt, the leaders were often seduced by ambition, the love of glory, and a passion for war.
That's what it is. Way down below the ocean, where I wanna be, she may be.
War. But religion, well or ill understood, acted upon the greater number. The Christian religion which they defended, or believed they defended, by inspiring them with a desire for the blessings of heaven and a contempt for life, elevated them above all perils, and enabled them to brave death on every occasion. Here is the whole truth. But this truth is too simple for such as disdain common roots, and cannot form a judgment upon human affairs without displaying all the parade of a proud and austere philosophy. For ourselves, who are persuaded that true philosophy consists in studying the human heart and the spirit of societies, not in vain theories, but in the faithful history of past ages, we will not refute brilliant sophisms by long arguments, but to show in all its splendor the valor of Christian soldiers, we will content ourselves with pursuing our recital, and making known with impartiality the labors, the reverses, and the victories of the soldiers of the cross. 34. The departure of the German Crusaders plunged the Eastern Christians into grief and consternation. The colonies, when left to their own resources, were only protected by the truce concluded between the Count de Montfort and Maud Cadell. The infidels had too great a superiority over 38, their enemies to respect, for any length of time, a treaty which they considered as an obstacle to the progress of their power. The Christians, threatened by new perils, again turned their eyes to the west. The Bishop of Ptolemy, accompanied by several knights, embarked for Europe, in order to solicit the aid of the faithful. The vessel in which he embarked had scarcely quitted the port, when it was swallowed up by the waves, and the bishop and every person of his suite perished. Other ships, that set sail a short time afterwards, were surprised by the tempest, and forced to return to the port of Tripoli, so that the prayers and complaints of the Christians of Palestine could not reach the ears of their brethren of the West. Nevertheless, the afflicting news of the situation of the feeble kingdom of Jerusalem soon became generally known. Some pilgrims, escaping from the perils of the sea, described, on their return, the triumphs and threats of the Saracens. But in the state of Europe at that moment, nothing could be more difficult than to induce nations to undertake a new crusade. The death of the Emperor Henry VI divided the princes and prelates of Germany, and Philip Augustus was still at war with Richard of England. One of the sons of Bela, King of Hungary, who pretended to take the cross, only assembled an army to agitate the kingdom and get possession of the crown. Amidst the fierce contentions that disturbed Europe, the Christian people seemed to have forgotten the tomb of Christ. A single man was touched with the misfortunes of the faithful of the East, and was not without hope of alleviating them. Innocent III, at the age of 33, had recently gained the suffrages of the conclave. 35, at a period of life in which the passions are generally masters, devoted to the most austere retirement, constantly occupied with the study of holy books, and ready at all times to confound new heresies by the force of reason, the successor of St. Peter shed tears on being informed of his elevation. But when seated on the pontifical throne, Innocent all at once exhibited a new character, the same man, who had appeared to dread 39, the splendor of a lofty position, become most eager, by any means, to increase his power, and displayed all the ambition and inflexible obstinacy of Gregory VII. His youth, which promised him a long reign, his ardor in the defense of justice and truth, his eloquence, his knowledge, his virtues, which drew upon him the respect of the faithful, all united to give birth to the hope that he would assure the triumph of religion, and that he would one day accomplish the projects of his predecessors. As the power of the Pope was founded upon the progress of the faith and the holy enthusiasm of the Christians, Innocent gave his first attention to the suppression of the dangerous innovations and imprudent doctrines that began to corrupt his age and menace the sanctuary. He particularly endeavored to reanimate the ardor for the Crusades, and to master the minds of kings and nations, to rally all Christians, and make them concur in the triumph of the Church. He spoke to them of the captivity of Jerusalem. He pointed to the tomb of Christ, and the holy places profaned by the presence and the domination of infidels. In a letter 36, addressed to the bishops, the clergy, the nobles, and people of France, England, Hungary, and Sicily, the sovereign pontiff made known the will, the menaces, and the promises of God. Since the lamentable loss of Jerusalem, said he, the Holy See has never ceased to cry towards heaven, and to exhort the faithful to avenge the injury done to Christ, thus banished from his heritage. Formerly your eye would not enter into his house, or see his life, whilst the ark of the Lord was in the camp. But now our princes, in this public calamity, abandon themselves to illegitimate amours, immerse themselves in voluptuousness, abuse the blessing that God has given them, and pursue each other with implacable hatred. Only thinking of revenging their own personal injuries, they never consider that our enemies insult us, saying, "Where is your God, who cannot deliver himself out of our hands?" We have profaned your sanctuary, and the places in which you pretend 40, your superstition had its birth. We have crushed the arms of the French, the English, the Germans, and subdued a second time the proud Spaniards. What remains then for us to do? To drive out those you have left in Syria, and to penetrate into the west to efface forever both your name and your memory. Assuming then a more paternal tone, prove, God innocent, that you have not lost your courage. Be prodigal, in the cause of God, of all you have received from him. If, on an occasion so pressing, you refuse to serve Christ, what excuse will you be able to offer at his terrible tribunal? If God died for man, shall man fear to die for his God? Will he refuse to give up his transitory life and the perishable goods of this world for him who lays before us the treasures of eternity? Prelates were at the same time sent through all the countries of Europe to preach peace among princes, and exhort them to unite against the common enemies of God. These prelates, clothed in the full confidence of the Holy See, were to engage cities and nobles to equip, at their own expense, for the Holy Land, a certain number of warriors, to serve there during 2 years at least. They promised remission of sins, 37, and a special protection of the Church, 38, to all that would take up the cross and arms, or would contribute to the equipment and support of the soldiers of Christ. To receive the pious tribute of the faithful, boxes were placed in all the churches. At the tribunal of penitence, the priests were ordered to command all sinners to concur in the holy enterprise. No error could find grace before God, without the sincere will of participating in the crusade. Zeal for the deliverance of the holy places appeared to be at that time the only virtue the Pope required of Christians, and even charity itself lost some of its value, if not exercised in promoting the crusades. As the Church of Rome was reproached with imposing upon the people burdens to which 41, she only applied the tip of her own finger, the Pope exhorted the heads of the clergy, and the clergy themselves, to set an example of devotedness and sacrifices. Innocent ordered his gold and silver plate to be melted to defray the expenses of the holy war, and would allow none but vessels of wood and clay to be seen on his table whilst the crusade lasted. The sovereign pontiff was so satisfied of the zeal and piety of the Christians, that he wrote to the Patriarch and King of Jerusalem, to announce to them the coming succors from the west. He neglected nothing that could augment the numbers of the soldiers of Christ. He addressed himself to the Emperor of Constantinople, and reproached him with indifference for the deliverance of the holy places. The Emperor Alexius endeavored, in his answer, to show his zeal for the cause of religion. But he added that the time of deliverance was not yet arrived, and that he feared to oppose himself to the will of God, irritated by the sins of the Christians. The Greek prince adroitly reminded him of the ravages committed in the territories of the empire by the soldiers of Frederick, and conjured the Pope to direct his reproofs against those who, feigning to labor for Jesus Christ, acted against the will of heaven. In his correspondence with Alexius, Innocent III did not at all conceal his pretensions to universal empire, and spoke in the character of sovereign arbiter of the kings of the East and West. He applied to himself these words addressed to Jeremiah: I have placed thee over the nations and over the kingdoms, to pull up and scatter, to edify and to plant. When speaking of the power of the popes and that of princes, he compared the one to the sun, which lights the universe during the day, and the other to the moon, which lights the earth during the night. The pretensions that Innocent put forth, and the hotness with which he sought to establish them, were, no doubt, injurious to the effect of his exhortations, and must have weakened the zeal of the Christian princes whom he wished to persuade to undertake the crusade. The princes and bishops of Germany were divided between Otho of Saxony and Philip of Swabia. The sovereign pontiff pronounced strongly for Otho, and threatened with the thunders of the church all who assisted the opposite party. In 42, the dissensions occasioned by this momentous affair, some availed themselves of the opportunity to gain the favor of the Pope, and others to secure themselves from the effects of his anger. But all Germany being engaged in the quarrel, nobody took the cross. One of the Pope's legates, Peter of Capua, succeeded in re-establishing peace between Richard Coeur de Lion and Philip Augustus. Richard, who was desirous of conciliating the goodwill of the Holy See, constantly promised to equip a fleet and collect an army to go and make war against the infidels. He proclaimed a tournament in his capital, in the midst of which he called upon the barons and knights to follow him into the east. But all these demonstrations, the sincerity of which was very suspicious, remained unproductive. It was not long before war again broke out between France and England. And Richard, who on all occasions repeated his vow of combating the infidels, was killed in a petty quarrel with Christians. Philip Augustus repudiated Ingeborg, daughter of the King of Denmark, to marry Agnes de Marigny. The sovereign pontiff, in a letter addressed to the faithful, strongly censured princes who gave themselves up to illegitimate amours. He ordered Philip Augustus to take back Ingeborg, and as Philip refused to obey, the kingdom of France was placed under an interdict. During several months all religious ceremonies were suspended. The pulpits of the gospel ceased to give forth the holy word. Church bells and the voice of prayer were silenced. Christian burial was refused to the dead. The sanctuary was closed against the faithful. A long mourning veil seemed to hang over cities and plains, from which the Christian religion was banished, and which might almost be fancied to be invaded by the Saracens. Although such as took the cross were exempt from the interdict, the spectacle which France presented discouraged and saddened its inhabitants. Philip Augustus, irritated against the Pope, showed very little disposition to revive their zeal. And the clergy, whose influence might have had a powerful effect, had less reason to deplore the captivity of Jerusalem than the unhappy state of the kingdom. At length the cure of Louis Germain began to fill France with the fame of his eloquence and his miracles. Falk 43 had at first led a very dissipated life, but, touched with sincere repentance, he was not satisfied with expiating his irregularities by penitence, but became desirous of bringing back all sinners to the path of salvation, and traveled through the provinces endeavoring to awaken in the people a contempt for the things of this life. God, to try him, permitted that, in his early sermons, Falk should be exposed to the ridicule of his auditors. But the truth he uttered soon obtained a marvelous ascendancy over all that came to hear him. Bishops invited him to preach in their dioceses. He received everywhere extraordinary honors, and both people and clergy flocked out to meet him, as if he had been an envoy of God. Fawkes, says the Chronicle of Saint Victor, had nothing remarkable in his vestments or manner of living. He traveled on horseback, and ate that which was given to him. He preached sometimes in churches, at others in public places, and not unfrequently amidst the excitement of tournaments. His eloquence was simple and natural. Safe, by his ignorance, from the bad taste of his age, he neither astonished his auditors by the vain subtleties of the schools, nor by an absurd mixture of passages from the scriptures and profane quotations from antiquity. His words, from being unadorned by the erudition then so much admired, were the more persuasive, and found their way more directly to the heart. 39. The most learned preachers ranked themselves among his disciples, and declared that the Holy Ghost spoke by his mouth. Animated by that faith which performs prodigies, he enchained at his pleasure the passions of the multitude, and caused to resound, even in the palaces of princes, the thunders of evangelical denunciations. 40. At his voice, all that had enriched themselves by fraud, brigandage, or usury, hastened to restore that which they had unjustly 44 acquired. libertines confessed their sins and devoted themselves to the austerities of penitence. 41. Prostitutes, following the example of Madeline, deplored the scandal of their lives, cut off their hair, exchanged their gaudy apparel for haircloth and mean garments, and made vows to sleep upon ashes and die in retirement. In short, the eloquence of Fawkes of Millie effected such miracles that contemporaries speak of him as of another St. Paul, sent for the conversion of his age. One of them even goes so far as to say that he dares not relate all he knows of him, fearing the incredulity of men. 42. Innocent III cast his eyes upon Fawkes of Millie, and confided to him the mission that, 50 years before, had been given to Saint Bernard. The new preacher of the crusade himself assumed the cross at a general chapter of the Order of Citeaux. At the sound of his voice, the zeal for the holy war, which had appeared extinct, blazed out again in all parts. In every city he passed through, the people crowded to listen to him. And all who were in a condition to bear arms, took the oath to combat the infidels. Several holy orders were associated with Fawkes of Millie. Martin Litz, of the Order of Citeaux, in the Diocese of Bale, and on the banks of the Rhine. Herluin, a monk of St. Denis, took his cause through the still wild countries of Bretagne and the lower Poitou. And Eustace, abbot of Blaye, crossed the sea twice, to awaken the enthusiasm and holy ardor of the provinces of England. These pious orders were not all endowed with the same eloquence, but all were animated by the most ardent zeal. The profanation of the holy places, the evil suffered by the Eastern Christians, and the remembrance of Jerusalem, imparted the most lively interest to their discourses, and 45, touched all hearts. 43. Such was the spirit spread through Europe, that simply to mention the name of Christ, or to speak of the city of God, held in captivity by the infidels, melted auditors to tears, and gave birth to transports of enthusiasm. The people everywhere evinced the same piety and the same feelings. But the cause of Christ still wanted the example and courage of princes and nobles. As a celebrated tournament had been proclaimed in Champagne, at which the boldest warriors of France, Germany, and Flanders were expected to be present, Fawkes repaired to the castle of Aigri-sur-Laine, 44, which was the rendezvous of the knights. His eloquence procured attention to the complaints of Shin, even amidst the profane and violent amusements of chivalry. When Fawkes spoke of Jerusalem, knights and barons neglected their jousts, the shivering of lances, or high feats of arms. They became insensible of the presence of dames and demoiselles, who accorded the prizes to velour, and turned a deaf ear to the gay minstrels who celebrated La Crosse en Châtie et Venduo for Elixir. All took the oath to fight against the infidels. And it must have been surprising to see numerous defenders of the cross come forth from these warlike festivals that were so severely reprehended by the Church. Among the princes and lords who enrolled themselves in the crusade, the most conspicuous were the Beaufort, Count of Champagne, and Louis, Count of Chartres and Blois, both relations of the kings of France and England. The father of Thibaut had followed Louis VII to the Second Crusade, and his elder brother had been King of Jerusalem. 2,500 knights owed him homage and military service, and the nobility of Champagne excelled in all the 46 noble exercises of arms. 45. The marriage of Thibaut with the heiress of Navarre brought to his standard a great number of warriors from the countries bordering on the Pyrenees. Louis, Count of Chartres and Blois, reckoned among his ancestors one of the most illustrious chiefs of the First Crusade, and was master of a province abounding in warriors of name. After the example of these two princes, the following distinguished leaders took the cross: the Count of St. Paul, the Count Gauthier and Jean de Brienne, Manasses de Lisle, Renard de Dampierre, Matthew de Montmorency, Hugh and Robert de Beauce, Damiens, Renaud de Boulogne, Geoffrey de Perche, Renaud de Montmirail, Simon de Montfort, who had just signed a treaty with the Saracens, but was no less ready on that account to take an oath to fight against them, and Geoffrey de Villardouin, 46, Marshal of Champagne, who has left us an account of this crusade in the unadorned language of his time. Among the ecclesiastics, history named Notron de Cherisy, Bishop of Soissons, Garnier, Bishop of Lingers, the Abbot of Luz, and the Abbot of Vaux-de-Cernay. The Bishop of Lingers, who had been the object of the censures of the Pope, expected to find in the pilgrimage to the Holy Land an opportunity of reconciling himself with the Holy See. The Abbot of Luz and the Abbot of Botacerla were both remarkable for their piety and learning. The former full of wisdom and moderation, the latter animated by a holy enthusiasm and an ardent zeal, which afterwards he but too strongly displayed against the Albigeois and the partisans of the Count of Toulouse. When the knights and barons returned to their homes, bearing a red cross upon their baldricks and their coats of 47, male, 47, they aroused by their presence the enthusiasm of their vassals and brothers in arms. The nobility of Flanders, after the example of those of Champagne, were anxious to prove their zeal for the recovery of the holy places. Baldwin, who had taken the part of Richard against Philip Augustus, saw beneath the standard of the cross an asylum against the anger of the King of France, and swore, in the church of Saint Donation of Bourges, to go into Asia to combat the Saracens. Mary, Countess of Flanders, sister of Thibaut, Count of Champagne, would not live separated from her husband. And although she was still in the flower of her youth, and was several months advanced in her pregnancy, took an oath to follow the Crusaders beyond the seas, and to quit a home she was doomed never to see again. The example of Baldwin was followed by his two brothers, 48, Eustace and Henry, Count of Sarbach. By Canon de Bethune, whose piety and eloquence were held in high estimation, and by Jacques d'Aves, son of him who, under the same name, had made himself so famous in the Third Crusade. Most of the knights and barons of Flanders and Hainaut also took the oath to share the labors and perils of the Holy War. The principal leaders first met at Soissons, and afterwards at Tonquin. In their assembly, they gave the command of the expedition to Thibaut, Count of Champagne. It was decided also that the Crusaders should repair to the east by sea. And, in consequence of this determination, 6 deputies were sent to Venice, 49, in order to obtain from the Republic the vessels required to transport the men and horses. The Venetians were at that period in the highest state of their greatness and prosperity. Amidst the convulsions that 48 had preceded and followed the fall of the Roman power, these industrious people had taken refuge in the islands that border the extremity of the Adriatic Gulf, and, placed upon the waves, had directed all their views to the Empire of the Sea, 50, of which the barbarians took no heed. Venice was at first under the dominion of the emperors of Constantinople. But, in proportion with the decline of the Greek Empire, the Republic acquired territory, strength, and splendor, which necessarily produced independence. From the 10th century, palaces of marble had replaced the humble huts of fishermen, scattered over the island of the Rialto. The cities of Istria and Dalmatia obeyed the sovereigns of the Adriatic Sea. The Republic, become formidable to the most powerful monarch, was able, at the least signal, to arm a fleet of 100 galleys, which it employed successively against the Greeks, the Saracens, and the Normans. The power of Venice was respected by all the nations of the West, and the republics of Genoa and Pisa in vain contended with her for the domination of the seas. The Venetians remembered with pride these words of Pope Alexander III, when the Republic had protested against the Emperor of Germany, who presented a ring to the Doge, saying, "Espouse the sea with this ring, that posterity may know that the Venetians have acquired the empire of the waves, and that the sea has been subjected to them as a woman is to her husband." The fleets of the Venetians constantly visited the ports of Greece and Asia. They transported pilgrims to Palestine, and returned laden with the rich merchandise of the East. The Venetians entered into the Crusades with less eagerness and enthusiasm than other Christian nations, but knew well how to profit by them for their own interests. Whilst the warriors of Christendom were fighting for glory, for kingdoms, or for the tomb of Christ, the merchants of Venice fought for counting houses, stores, and commercial privileges. And avarice often made them undertake that which other nations could not have been able to effect but by an excess of religious zeal. The Republic, which owed all its prosperity to its commercial relations, sought without scruple 49, the friendship and protection of the Mussulman powers of Syria and Egypt. And often, even when all Europe was arming against the infidels, the Venetians were accused of supplying the enemies of the Christian nations with both arms and provisions. When the deputies of the Crusaders arrived at Venice, the Republic headed for Doge Dandolo, so celebrated in its annals. Dandolo had for a length of time served his country in important missions, and in the command of its fleets and armies. Now, placed at the head of its government, he watched over its liberties and the operations of its laws. His labors in war and peace, his useful regulations of the money currency, with his administration of justice and public security, deservedly procured him the esteem and gratitude of his fellow citizens. He had acquired the power of mastering, by words, the passions of the multitude, even in the stormy disputes of a republic. Nobody was more skillful in seizing a favorable opportunity, or in taking advantage of the least circumstance for the furtherance of his designs. At the age of 90, the Doge of Venice exhibited no symptoms of senility but virtue and experience. 51. Everything that could save his country aroused his activity and inflamed his courage. With the spirit of calculation and economy which distinguished his compatriots, Dandolo mingled passions the most generous, and threw an air of grandeur over all the enterprises of a trading people. His patriotism, always sustained by the love of glory, appeared to possess something of that sentiment of honor and that chivalric greatness of soul which formed the predominant characteristic of his age. Dandolo 52, praised with warmth an enterprise that appeared 50, glorious to him, and in which the interests of his country were not opposed to those of religion. The deputies required vessels to transport 4,500 knights and 20,000 foot, with provisions for the Christian army for 9 months. Dandolo promised, in the name of the Republic, to furnish the necessary provisions and vessels, on condition that the Crusaders should engage to pay the Venetians the sum of 85,000 silver marks. 53. As he was not willing that the people of Venice should be unconnected with the expedition of the French Crusaders, Dandolo proposed to the deputies to arm, at the expense of the Republic, 50 galleys, and demanded for his country half of the conquests that might be made in the East. The deputies accepted without hesitation the more interested than generous proposals of the Doge. The conditions of the treaty were first examined in the Doge's Council, 54, composed of 6 patricians. It was afterwards ratified in 2 other councils, 55, and at last presented for the sanction of the people, who then exercised supreme power. 56. A general assembly was convoked in the church of St. Mark, and when the Mass of the Holy Ghost had been celebrated, the Marshal of Champagne, accompanied by the other deputies, arose, and addressing the people of Venice, pronounced a discourse, the simple and unaffected expressions of which paint, better than we possibly can, the spirit and feelings of the heroic periods of our history. 57. The Lords 51, and Barons of France, the most high and the most powerful, have sent us to you to pray you, in the name of God, to take pity on Jerusalem, which the Turks hold in bondage. They cry to you for mercy, and supplicate you to accompany them to avenge the disgrace of Jesus Christ. They have made choice of you, because they know that no people that be upon the sea have so great power as your nation. They have commanded us to throw ourselves at your feet, and not to rise until you shall have granted our request, until you shall have had pity on the Holy Land beyond the seas. At these words the deputies were moved to tears. 58. And feeling it no degradation to humble themselves in the cause of Christ. 59. They fell upon their knees and held up their hands in a supplicating manner towards the assembly of the people. The strong emotion of the barons and knights communicated itself to the Venetians, and 10,000 voices replied as one, "We grant your request." The Doge, ascending the tribunal, praised highly the earnestness and loyalty of the French barons, and spoke with enthusiasm of the honor God conferred upon the people of Venice in choosing them from amongst all other nations, 60, to partake in the glory of the most noble of enterprises, and associate them with the most valiant of warriors. He then read the treaty entered into with the Crusaders, and conjured his assembled fellow citizens to give their consent to it in the forms ordained by 52, the laws of the Republic. Then the people arose, and cried with an unanimous shout, "We consent to it." All the inhabitants of Venice were present at this meeting. An immense multitude covered the place of St. Mark and filled the neighboring streets. Religious enthusiasm, love of country, surprise and joy were manifested by acclamations so loud and general, that it might be said, according to the expression of the Marshal of Champagne, that the world was about to engage in one common conflict. On the morrow of this memorable day, the deputies of the barons repaired to the palace of St. Mark, and swore on their swords and the gospel, to fulfill all the engagements they had made. The preamble of the treaty recalled the faults and the misfortunes of the princes who had to that time undertaken the deliverance of the Holy Land, and praised the wisdom and prudence of the French lords and knights, who neglected nothing to assure the success of an enterprise full of difficulties and perils. The deputies were charged to endeavor to cause the conditions they had sworn to be adopted by their brothers in arms, the barons and knights, by the whole of their nation, and if possible, by their sovereign lord the King of France. The treaty was written on parchment and sent immediately to Rome to receive the approbation of the Pope. And, full of confidence in the future, as well as in the alliance they had contracted, the French knights and the patricians of Venice exchanged the most touching protestations of friendship. 61. The Dutch lent the Germans the sum of 10,000 silver marks, and the latter swore never to forget the services the Republic had rendered to Jesus Christ. There were then shed, says Bellarmine, many tears of tenderness and joy. The government of Venice was a new spectacle for the French nobles. The liberations of the people were perfectly unknown to them, and must have struck them with astonishment. On the other side, the embassy of the knights and barons could not fail to flatter the pride of the Venetians. The latter felicitated themselves upon being thus acknowledged as the greatest maritime nation, and, never 53, separating their glory from their commercial interests, rejoiced at having made so advantageous a bargain. The knights, on the contrary, only thought of honor and the cause of Christ. And although the treaty was ruinous to the Crusaders, they bore back the news to their companions in arms with the greatest joy and satisfaction. 62. The preference given to the Venetians by the Crusaders naturally excited the jealousy of the other maritime powers of Italy. Thus the French deputies, upon going to Pisa and Genoa to solicit the aid of the two republics in the name of Jesus Christ, met with a cold reception and a perfect indifference for the deliverance of the holy places. The account of what had taken place at Venice, and the presence of the barons, did not fail, however, to arouse the enthusiasm of the inhabitants of Lombardy and Piedmont. A great number of them took the cross and arms, and promised to follow Boniface, Marquis of Montferrat, to the Holy Land. The Marshal of Champagne, whilst crossing Mount Cenis, met Gabriel de Brienne, who had taken the cross at the castle of Ypres, and was on his way to Apulia. He had married one of the daughters of Tancred, last king of Sicily. Followed by 60 knights of Champagne, he was going to endeavor to make good the claims of his wife, and conquer the kingdom founded by the Norman knights. The Marshal Beauhardoin and Gabriel de Brienne congratulated each other upon the brilliant prospects of their expeditions, and promised to meet again in the plains of Egypt and Syria. Thus the future presented nothing to the knights of the 54, crossed by victories and trophies. And the hope of conquering distant kingdoms redoubled their ardor. When the deputies arrived in Champagne, they found Thibaut dangerously ill. The prince was so delighted at learning the success of their embassy, that, heedless of the disease that had confined him to his bed, he insisted upon putting on his armor and mounting on horseback. But this was great pity and misfortune, says Bellarmine. For the malady increased, and gathered such strength, that he declared his will, took leave of his friends, and got no more on horseback. Thibaut, the model and hope of the Christian knights, died in the flower of his age, deeply regretted by his vassals and companions in arms. He deplored before the barons the rigorous destiny that condemned him thus to die without glory, at the moment that he was about to gather the palms of victory or of martyrdom in the plains of the East. He exhorted them to perform the vow he had made to God to deliver Jerusalem, and left them all his treasures to be employed in this holy enterprise. An epitaph in Latin verse, which still exists, celebrates the virtues and pious zeal of Count Thibaut, recalls the preparations for his pilgrimage, 63, and terminates by saying that this young prince found the heavenly Jerusalem, when about to seek the earthly Jerusalem. After the death of the Count of Champagne, the barons and knights who had taken the cross assembled to choose another leader, and their election fell upon the Count de Bar and the Duke of Burgundy. The Count de Bar refused to take the command of the Christian army. Eudfrey, Duke of Burgundy, still mourned the death of his father, who had died in Palestine after the Third Crusade, and could not be induced to quit his duchy to undertake the pilgrimage to the East. The refusal of these two princes was a subject of scandal for the soldiers of the cross. and contemporary history informs us that they afterwards repented of the indifference they had evinced for the cause of Christ. 64. The Duke 55 of Burgundy, who died within a few years, was desirous of taking the cross on his bed of death, and, to expiate his fault, sent several of his warriors into Palestine. The knights and barons then offered the command to Boniface, Marquis of Montferrat. 65. Boniface belonged to a family of Christian heroes. His brother Conrad had rendered himself famous by the defense of Tyre, and he himself had already fought many times against the infidels. He did not hesitate in complying with the wishes of the Crusaders. He came to Soissons, where he received the cross from the hands of the Curé of Neuilly, and was proclaimed leader of the crusade in the Church of Notre Dame, in the presence of the clergy and the people. 2 years had passed away since the sovereign pontiff had ordered the bishops to preach the crusade in their dioceses. The situation of the Christians of the East became every day more deplorable. The kings of Jerusalem and Armenia, the patriarchs of Antioch in the Holy City, and the grand masters of the military orders, addressed day after day their complaints and lamentations to the Holy See. Touched by their prayers, Innocent again exhorted the faithful, and conjured the Crusaders to hasten their departure, warmly censuring the indifference of those who, after having taken the cross, appear to be forgetful of their vow. The Christian father, above all, reproached the ecclesiastics with their tardiness in paying the 40th part of their revenues, destined to the expenses of the Holy War, and you and we, said he, and all persons supported by the goods of the Church, ought we not all to fear that the inhabitants of Nineveh should appear against us at the day of judgment, and pronounce our condemnation? For they were made penitent by the preaching of Jonas. And you, not only you have not rent your hearts, you have not even opened your hands to succor Christ in his poverty, and repulse the opprobrium with which the infidels load him. The epoch of the Holy War 56, being for Christians a season of penitence, the sovereign pontiff proscribed, in his letters, sumptuousness in living, splendor in dress, and public amusements. And although the new crusade had been first preached as a tournament of Ecre, tournaments were in the number of diversions and spectacles forbidden to all Christians by the Holy Father during the space of 5 years. To reanimate the courage and confidence of those who had taken the cross, Innocent told them of the new divisions that had sprung up among the Muslim princes, and of the scourges with which God had recently afflicted Egypt. God, cried the pontiff, has struck the country of Babylon with the rod of his power. The Nile, 66, that river of paradise, which fertilizes the land of the Egyptians, has not had its accustomed course. This chastisement has given them up to death, and prepared the triumph of their enemies. The letters of the Pope had the desired effect. The Marquis of Montferrat went into France towards the autumn of the year 1201, and the whole winter was devoted to preparations for the Holy War. These preparations were unaccompanied by disorder, and the princes and barons refused to receive under their banners any but disciplined soldiers and men accustomed to the use of the lance and the sword. Some voices were raised against the Jews, whom they desired to force to contribute to the expenses of the Holy War. 67. But the Pope took them under his protection, and threatened all who made attempts upon their lives or liberty with excommunication. 57. Before they left their homes, the Crusaders had to deplore the loss of the Holy Order who had awakened their zeal and animated their courage. Fawkes fell sick, and died in his parish of Neuilly. Some time before, loud murmurs had been heard respecting his conduct, and his words had ceased to exercise their accustomed power over the minds of his auditors. Fawkes had received considerable sums of money destined for the expenses of the Holy War, and as he was accused of appropriating these to his own use, the more money he amassed, says James of Vitry, 68, the more consideration and credit he lost. The suspicions attached to his conduct were not, however, generally credited. The Marshal of Champagne informs us, in his history, that the knights and barons were deeply affected by the death of the Curé of Neuilly. Fawkes was buried in the church of his parish with great pomp. His tomb, a monument of the piety of his contemporaries, attracted, even in the last century, the respect and veneration of the faithful. 69. With the earliest days of spring the Crusaders prepared to quit their homes, and knew, says Villehardouin, that many tears were shed at their parting, and at taking leave 58, of their relations and friends. The Count of Flanders, the Counts of Blois and St. Paul, followed by a great number of Flemish warriors and their vassals. The Marshal of Champagne, accompanied by several Champenois knights, advanced across Burgundy and past the Alps to repair to Venice. The Marquis Boniface soon joined them, bringing with him the Crusaders of Lombardy, Piedmont, Savoy, and the countries situated between the Alps and the Rhone. Venice also received within its walls the warriors from the banks of the Rhine, some under the command of the Bishop of Halberstadt and others under that of Mortonix, who had persuaded them to take arms, and still continued to animate them by the example of his virtues and piety. When the Crusaders reached Venice, 70, the fleet that was to transport them into Asia, was ready to set sail. They were at first received with every demonstration of joy. But amidst the festivities that followed their arrival, 71, the Venetians called upon the barons to redeem their word, and pay the sum agreed upon for transporting the Christian army. And then it was that, with deep grief, the barons became aware of the absence of a great number of the companions in arms. Jean de Massel, Châtelaine of Bruges, and Thierry, son of Philip, Count of Flanders, had promised Baldwin to bring to him, at Venice, Marguerite, his wife, and a chosen band of Flemish warriors. They did not keep their appointment, for having embarked upon the ocean, they had directed their course to Palestine. Renaud de Dampierre, to whom Thibaut, Count of Champagne, had left all his treasures to be employed in the voyage to the Holy Land, had embarked with a great number of Champenois knights at the port of Bari. The Bishop of Autun, Gilles, Count of Ferrez, and several other leaders, after having sworn upon the gospel to join the other crusaders, had set out from Marseille, and others from Genoa. Thus half the crusaders did not come to 59, Venice, which had been agreed upon as the general rendezvous of the Christian army, by which, says Villehardouin, they received great shame, and many misadventures afterwards befell them in consequence of it. This breach of faith might prove very injurious to the enterprise. But what most grieved the princes and barons assembled at Venice was the impossibility of fulfilling their engagements with the Republic without the concurrence of their unfaithful companions. They sent messengers into all parts to warn the crusaders that had set out, and to implore them to join the main army. But whether most of the pilgrims were dissatisfied with the agreement entered into with the Venetians, or whether it appeared to them more convenient and safe to embark at ports in their own vicinity, a very small number of them could be prevailed upon to repair to Venice. Those who were already in that city were neither sufficiently numerous nor sufficiently rich to pay the promised amount, or fulfill the engagements made in their names. Although the Venetians were more interested in the crusade than the French knights, as they possessed a part of the cities of Tyre and Ptolemy, which they were going to defend, they were unwilling to make any sacrifice, and the barons, on their side, were too proud to ask any favor, or to solicit the Venetians to change or moderate the conditions of the treaty. Each of the crusaders was required to pay the price of his passage. The rich paid for the poor. Soldiers as well as knights, being eager to give all the money they possessed, persuaded, they said, that God was powerful enough to return it to them 100-fold, when it should please him. The Count of Flanders, the Counts of Blois and St. Paul, the Marquis of Montferrat, and several other leaders despoiled themselves of their plate, their jewels, and everything they had that was most valuable, 72, and only retained their horses and arms. Notwithstanding this noble sacrifice, the Crusaders still were indebted to the Republic a sum of 50,000 silver marks. The Doge then assembled the people, and represented to them that it was not honorable to employ too much rigor, and proposed to demand 60 of the Crusaders the assistance of their army for the Republic, until they could discharge their debt. The city of Zaire had been for a length of time under the dominion of the Venetians. But thinking the government of a king less insupportable than that of a republic, it had given itself up to the King of Hungary, and, under the protection of a new master, braved the authority and menaces of Venice. After having obtained the approbation of the people, Dandolo proposed to the Crusaders to assist the Republic in subduing a revolted city, and promised to put off the entire execution of the treaty until God, by their common conquests, should have given them the means of fulfilling their promises. This proposition was received with much joy by the greater part of the Crusaders, who could not support the idea of being unable to keep their word. The barons and knights deemed it prudent to conciliate the Venetians, who were so serviceable to them in carrying out their enterprise, and thought they did but little to pay their debt by an affair in which they should expend nothing but their blood. Some murmurs, however, arose in the Christian army. Many of the Crusaders recollected the oath they had taken to fight the infidels, and could not make up their minds to turn their arms against a Christian people. The Pope had sent the Cardinal Peter of Capua to Venice, to deter the pilgrims from an enterprise which he termed sacrilegious. The King of Hungary had taken the cross, and by doing so had placed himself under the especial protection of the Church. And to attack a city belonging to him was to declare themselves enemies of the Church itself. Henry Dandolo braved menaces and reproaches that he deemed to be unjust. The privileges of the Crusaders, said he, could not screen the guilty from the severity of laws divine and human. Crusades were not undertaken to promote the ambition of kings or protect rebellious nations. 73. The Pope had not the power to enjoin the authority of sovereigns, or turn the 61 Crusaders aside from a legitimate enterprise. From a war made against revolted subjects, against pirates whose brigandage perilled the freedom of the seas, and jeopardized the safety of pilgrims on their way to the Holy Land. To complete this conquest over all scruples, and dissipate all fears, the Doge resolved to associate himself with the perils and labors of the crusade, and to engage his fellow citizens to declare themselves the companions in arms of the Crusaders. The people being solemnly convoked, Dandolo ascended the pulpit of St. Mark, and demanded of the assembled Venetians permission to take the cross. Signors, said he to them, you have made an engagement to concur in the most glorious of enterprises. The warriors with whom you have contracted a holy alliance surpass all other men in piety and valor. For myself, you see that I am laden with years, and have need of repose. But the glory that is promised to us restores me courage and strength to brave all the perils, to support all the labors of war. I feel by the ardor that leads me on, by the zeal which animates me, that nobody will merit your confidence, nobody will conduct you so well as the man you have chosen as head of your republic. If you will permit me to fight for Jesus Christ, and allow my son to perform the duties you have confided to me, I will go and lie or die with you and the pilgrims. At this discourse, his whole auditory was much affected, and the people loudly applauded the resolution of the Doge. Dandolo descended from the tribunal, and was led in triumph to the foot of the altar, where the cross was attached to his ducal cap. A great number of Venetians followed his example, and swore to die for the deliverance of the holy places. By the skillful policy, the Doge completely won the Crusaders, and placed himself, in a manner, at the head of the crusade. He soon found himself sufficiently powerful to deny the authority of the Cardinal of Capua, who spoke in the name of the Pope, and pretended to have a right to direct the Holy War, in his character of Legate of the Holy See. Dandolo told the envoy of Innocent that the Christian army stood in no need of leaders to conduct it, and that the legates of the sovereign pontiff ought to content themselves with edifying the Crusaders by their examples and discourses. This bold, free language very much astonished the French 62 barons, accustomed to respect the will of the Holy See. But the Dutch, by taking the cross, had inspired them with a confidence nothing could shake. The cross of the pilgrims was, for the Venetians and French, a pledge of alliance, a sacred tie, which united all their interests, and made of them, in a manner, but one same nation. From that time no one listened to those who spoke in the name of the Holy See, 74, or persisted in raising scruples in the minds of the Crusaders. The barons and knights showed the same zeal and ardor for the expedition against Zara as the Venetians themselves. The army of the Crusaders was ready to embark, when there happened, says Villehardouin, a great wonder, an unhoped-for circumstance, the strangest that ever was heard of. 75. Isaac, Emperor of Constantinople, had been dethroned by his brother Alexius. Abandoned by all his friends, deprived of sight, and loaded with irons, this unhappy prince languished in a dungeon. The son of Isaac, named also Alexius, who shared the captivity of his father, having deceived the vigilance of his guards and broken his chains, had fled into the west, in the hope that the princes and kings would one day undertake his defense, and declare war against the usurper of the imperial throne. Philip of Swabia, who had married Irene, the daughter of Isaac, 76, received the young prince kindly. But he was not then in a position to undertake anything in his favor, being fully engaged in defending himself against the arms of Otho and the menaces of the Holy See. Young Alexius next in vain threw himself at the feet of the Pope to implore his assistance. Whether the pontiff saw in the son of Isaac only the brother-in-law of 63, Philip of Swabia, then considered an enemy to the court of Rome, or whether all his attention was directed towards the east, he gave no ear to the complaints of Alexius, and seemed to dread countenancing a war against Greece. The fugitive prince had in vain solicited most of the Christian monarchs, when he was advised to address himself to the Crusaders, the noblest warriors of the West. The arrival of his ambassadors created a lively sensation at Venice. The knights and barons were impressed with generous pity by the account of his misfortunes. They had never defended a more glorious cause. To avenge injured innocents, to remedy a great calamity, stirred the spirit of Dandolo. And the proud republicans, whose head he was, genuinely deplored the fate of a fugitive emperor. They had not forgotten that the usurper preferred to an alliance with and one with the Genoese and Pisans. It appeared to them that the cause of Alexius was their own, and that their vessels ought to bear him back to the ports of Greece and Byzantium. Nevertheless, as everything was prepared for the conquest of Zara, the decision of this business was deferred to a more favorable opportunity. And the fleet, with the Crusaders on board, set sail amidst the sounds of martial music and the acclamation of the whole population of Venice. Never had a fleet so numerous or so magnificently equipped been seen in the Adriatic Gulf. The sea was covered with 480 ships. The number of the combatants, horse and foot, amounted to 40,000 men. After having subdued Trieste and some other maritime cities of Istria that had shaken off the yoke of Venice, the Crusaders arrived before Zara on the 10th day of November, 1202, the eve of St. Martin. Zara, 77, situated on the eastern side of the Adriatic Gulf, 60 leagues from Venice, and 5 leagues north of Jadera, an ancient Roman colony, was a rich and populous city, fortified by high walls, and surrounded by A64, sea-studded with rocks. The King of Hungary had sent troops to defend it, and the inhabitants had sworn to bury themselves beneath the ruins of the place rather than surrender to the Venetians. At the sight of the ramparts of the city, the Crusaders perceived all the difficulty of the enterprise, and the party opposed to this war again ventured to murmur. The leaders, however, gave the signal for the assault. As soon as the chains of the port were broken, and the machines began to make the walls shake, the inhabitants forgot the resolution they had formed of dying in defense of their ramparts, and, filled with dread, sent deputies to the Doge, who promised to pardon them on account of their repentance. But the deputies charged with the petition for peace met with several crusaders among the besiegers, who said to them, "Why did you surrender? You have nothing to fear from the French?" These imprudent words rekindled the war. The deputies, on their return, announced to the inhabitants that all the crusaders were not their enemies, and that Zara would preserve its liberty if the people and soldiers were willing to defend it. The party of the malcontents, whose object was to divide the army, seized this opportunity for reviving the complaints. The most ardent amongst them, insinuating themselves into the tents of the soldiers, and endeavoring to discuss them with a war which they termed impious. Guy, abbot of Vox Tacerni, of the Order of Citeaux, made himself conspicuous by his endeavors to secure the failure of the enterprise against Zara. Everything that could divert the march of the Crusaders from the route to the holy places, 78, was, in his eyes, an attack upon religion. The most brilliant exploits, if not performed in the cause of Christ, could command neither his esteem nor his approbation. The abbot of Cerni was deficient in neither subtlety nor eloquence, and knew how to employ both prayers and menaces effectively. He had that influence over the pilgrims that in 65, inflexible-minded and ardent, obstinate character always obtains over the multitude. In a council, he arose, and forbade the Crusaders to draw their swords against Christians, and was about to read a letter from the Pope, when he was interrupted by threats and cries. Amidst the tumult which followed in the council and the army, the abbot of Cerni would have been in danger of his life, if the Count de Montfort, who partook his sentiments, had not drawn his sword in his defense. The barons and knights could not, however, forget the promise they had made to fight for the Republic of Venice. nor could they think of laying down their arms in presence of an enemy that had promised to surrender, and who now defied their attacks. The greater the efforts of the Count of Montfort and the Abbot of Cernay to interrupt the war, the more they conceived their honor and glory to be engaged to continue the siege they had begun. Whilst the malcontents were giving vent to their scruples and complaints, the bravest of the army proceeded to the assault. The besieged, whose hopes were built upon the divisions among their enemies, placed crosses upon the walls, persuaded that this revered sign would protect them more effectively than their machines of war. But they were not long in finding that there was no safety for them except in submission. On the 5th day of the siege, without having offered their enemies any serious resistance, they opened their gates, and only obtained from the conqueror liberty and life. The city was given up to pillage, and the booty divided between the Venetians and the French. One of the results of this conquest was a fresh quarrel in the victorious army, in which more blood flowed than had been shed during the siege. That season being too far advanced to allow the fleet to put to sea, the Doge proposed to the Crusaders to winter at Zara. The two nations occupied different quarters of the city. But as the Venetians had chosen the handsomest and most commodious houses, the French loudly proclaimed their dissatisfaction. After a few complaints and many threats, they had recourse to arms, and every street became the theater of a conflict. The inhabitants of Zara beheld with delight the sanguinary disputes of their conquerors. The partisans of the Abbot of 66, Cernay applauded in secret the deplorable consequences of a war they had condemned, whilst the Doge of Venice and the barons implored every effort to separate the combatants. Their prayers and threats at first had no effect in appeasing this horrible tumult, which was prolonged to the middle of the night. On the morrow, all the passions that divided the army were near breaking out with increased fury. Whilst interring their dead, the French and Venetians renewed their disputes and menaces. The leaders were, for more than a week, in despair of being able to calm the irritated spirits of their followers, and reunite the soldiers of the two nations. Scarcely was order re-established when a letter was received from the Pope, who disapproved of the capture of Zara, ordered the Crusaders to renounce the booty they had made in a Christian city, and to engage themselves, by a solemn vow, to repair the injuries they had inflicted. Innocent reproached the Venetians bitterly with having seduced the soldiers of Christ into this impious and sacrilegious war. This letter from the Pope was received with respect by the French, with disdain by the Crusaders of Venice. The latter openly refused to bow to the decisions of the Holy See, and to secure the fruits of their victory, began to demolish the ramparts of Zara. The French barons could not endure the idea of having incurred the anger of the Pope, and sent deputies to Rome to endeavor to mitigate the displeasure of His Holiness, and solicit their pardon, alleging that they had only obeyed the law of necessity. The greater part of them, though fully determined to retain all they had obtained, promised the Pope to restore their spoils. They undertook, by a solemn act, addressed to all Christians, to repair the wrongs they had done, and to merit by their conduct pardon for past errors. 79. Their submission, far more than their promises, disarmed the anger of the Pope. 67. Who replied to them with mildness, and commanded the leaders to salute the knights and pilgrims, giving them absolution and his benediction, as to his children. He exhorted them, in his letter, to set out for Syria, without turning to the right or the left, and permitting them to cross the sea with the Venetians, whom he had just excommunicated, 80, but only from necessity, and with bitterness of heart. If the Venetians persisted in their disobedience, the sovereign pontiff advised the barons, when they arrived in Palestine, to separate themselves from a people reproved of God, for fear of bringing a malediction upon the Christian army, as formerly Ocean had brought down the divine wrath upon the Israelites. Innocent promised the Crusaders to protect them in their expedition, and to watch over their wants during the perils of the Holy War. In order that you may not want provisions, said he to them, we will write to the Emperor of Constantinople to furnish you with them, as he has promised. If that be refused to which is refused to none, it will not be unjust, if, after the example of many holy persons, you take provisions wherever you may find them. For it will be known that you are devoted to the cause of Christ, to whom all the world belongs. 81. These counsels and these promises, which so completely reveal to us the spirit of the 13th century and the policy of the Holy See, were received by the knights and barons as evidence of the paternal goodness of the sovereign pontiff. But the face of things was about again to change. And fortune, which sported with the decisions of the Pope as well as those of the pilgrims, was not long in 68, giving an entirely new direction to the events of the crusade. Ambassadors from Philip of Swabia, brother-in-law of young Alexius, arrived at Zara, and addressed the council of the lords and barons, assembled in the palace of the Doge of Venice. "Signors," said they, "the puissant king of the Romans sends us to recommend to you the young Prince Alexius, and to place him in your hands, under the safeguard of God. We do not come for the purpose of turning you aside from your holy enterprise, but to offer you an easy and a certain means of accomplishing your noble designs. We know that you have only taken up arms for the love of Christ and of justice. We come, therefore, to propose to you to assist those who are oppressed by unjust tyranny, and to secure at once the triumph of the laws of religion and humanity. We propose to you to turn your victorious arms towards the capital of Greece, which groans under the rod of an usurper, and to assure yourselves forever of the conquest of Jerusalem by that of Constantinople. You know, as well as we do, how many evils our fathers, the companions of Godfrey, Conrad, and Louis the Young, suffered from having left behind them a powerful empire, the conquest and submission of which would have become a source of victories to their arms. What have you not now to dread from this Alexius, more cruel and more perfidious than his predecessors, who has gained the throne by parricide, who has, at once, betrayed the laws of religion and nature, and whose only means of escaping from the punishment due to his crime is by allying himself with the Saracens? We will not tell you how easy a matter it will be to wrest the empire from the hands of a tyrant hated by his subjects, for your Lord loves obstacles and delights in dangers. Nor will we spread before your eyes the riches of Byzantium and Greece, for your generous souls aim at nothing in this conquest, but the glory of your arms and the cause of Jesus Christ. If you overturn the power of the usurper in order that the legitimate sovereign may reign, the son of Isaac promises, under the faith of oaths the most inviolable, to maintain, during a year, both your fleet and your army, and to pay you 200,000 silver marks towards the 69 expenses of the war. He will accompany you in person in the conquest of Syria or Egypt. And if you think proper, will furnish 10,000 men, as his portion of the armament. And, moreover, will maintain, during the whole of his life, 500 knights in the Holy Land. But that which must weigh above all other considerations, with warriors and Christian heroes, is that Alexius is willing to swear, on the Holy Gospel, to put an end to the heresy which now defiles the Empire of the East, and to subject the Greek Church to the Church of Rome. So many advantages being attached to the enterprise proposed to you, we feel confident you will listen to our prayers. We see in Holy Writ that God sometimes employed men the most simple and the most obscure to make known his will to his chosen people. On this occasion, it is a young prince he has appointed the instrument of his designs. It is Alexius that Providence has commissioned to lead you in the way of the Lord, and to point out to you the road you must follow to render certain the triumph of the armies of Jesus Christ. This discourse made a strong impression upon a great number of the knights and barons, but it did not command the suffrages of the whole assembly. The Doge and the Lord dismissed the ambassadors, telling them they would deliberate upon the proposals of Alexius. Warm debates then ensued in the council. Those that had been averse to the siege of Zara, among whom the abbot of Fox-Tassila was so conspicuous, opposed the expedition to Constantinople with great vehemence. They were indignant that the interests of God should be placed in the balance against those of Alexius. The added that this Isaac, whose cause they were called upon to defend, was himself an usurper, elevated by a revolution to the throne of the Comnenus. That he had been, during the Third Crusade, the most cruel enemy of the Christians, the most faithful ally of the Turks. As for the rest, the nations of Greece, accustomed to the change of masters, supported the usurpation of Alexius without murmuring, and the Latins had not quitted their homes to avenge the injuries of a people that really did not call upon them for aid. The same orators further said that Philip of Swabia 70 exhorted the Crusaders to assist Alexius, but was content himself with making speeches and sending ambassadors. They warned the Christians not to trust to the promises of a young prince who engaged to furnish armies and had not a single soldier, who offered treasures and possessed nothing, who, besides, had been brought up amongst the Greeks, and would, most likely, someday turn his arms against his benefactors. If you are so sensible to misfortune, added they, and impatient to defend the cause of justice and humanity, listen to the groans of our brethren in Palestine, who are menaced by the Saracens, and who have no earthly hope but in your courage. They moreover told the Crusaders that if they wished for easy victories and brilliant conquests, they had but to turn their eyes towards Egypt, the population of which was at that moment devoured by horrible famine, and which the 7 plates of scripture yielded up to the arms of the Christians almost without defense. The Phoenicians, who had caused complaint against the Emperor of Constantinople, were not at all affected by these arguments, and appeared much more inclined to make war upon the Greeks than the infidels. They were anxious to destroy the warehouses of their rivals the Pisans, now established in Greece, and to see their ships crossing the straits of the Bosphorus in triumph. Their doge nourished a keen resentment on account of some personal offense, and to inflame the minds of his compatriots, he magnified all the wrongs inflicted by the Greeks on his own country and the Christians of the West. If ancient chronicles may be believed, Dondola was impelled by another motive, which he did not avow before the Crusaders. The Sultan of Damascus, made aware of a Christian army being assembled at Venice, and terrified at the crusade that was preparing, had sent a considerable treasure to the Republic, to engage it to divert the Crusaders from an expedition into the East. Whether we yield faith to this account, or whether we consider it as a fable invented by hatred and party spirit, such assertions, collected by contemporaries, at least prove that violent suspicions were then entertained against the Venetians by the dissatisfied Crusaders, and particularly by the Christians of Syria, justly 71, irritated at not being assisted by the soldiers of the cross. 82. Nevertheless, we feel bound to add that the majority of the French Crusaders stood in no need of being stimulated by the example or speeches of the Doge to undertake a war against the Greek Empire. Even those who opposed the new expedition the most strongly, as well as all the other Crusaders, entertained an inveterate hatred and a sovereign contempt for the Greeks. And the discussions had only the more inflamed the general mind against a nation considered inimical to the Christians. Several ecclesiastics, having at their head the Abbot of Luz, a personage remarkable for his piety and the purity of his manners, did not accord in opinion with the Abbot of Vox Tacerni, and maintained that there was much danger in leading an army into a country devastated by famine. That Greece presented much greater advantages to the Crusaders than Egypt, and that there could be no doubt that the conquest of Constantinople was the most certain means of securing to the Christians the possession of Jerusalem. 72. These ecclesiastics were particularly fascinated by the hope of one day seeing the Greek Church united to that of Rome, and they constantly announced in their discourses the approaching period of concord and peace among all Christian people. Many knights contemplated with satisfaction the prospect of the union of the two churches, likely to be brought about by their arms. But they yielded further to motives not less powerful over their minds. They had sworn to defend innocence and the rights of the oppressed, and they believed they performed their duty in embracing the cause of Alexius. Some of them, without doubt, who had heard of the vast wealth of Byzantium, might believe that they should not return from such a brilliant undertaking empty-handed. But such was the spirit of the lords and knights, that by far the greater number were attracted by the mere prospect of the perils, and still more by the wonders of the enterprise. After a long deliberation, it was decided in the Council of the Crusaders that the proposals of Alexius should be accepted, and that the Christian army should embark for Constantinople at the commencement of spring. Before the siege of Zara, the report of the armament of the Crusaders, and of an expedition against Greece had reached the court of Byzantium. The usurper of the throne of Isaac immediately sought for means to avert the storm about to fall upon his states, and hastened to send ambassadors to the Pope, whom he considered the arbiter of peace and war in the West. These ambassadors were ordered to declare to the sovereign pontiff that the prince who reigned at Constantinople was the only legitimate emperor, that the son of Isaac had no right to the empire, that an expedition against Greece would be an unjust enterprise, dangerous, and adverse to the great designs of the crusade. The Pope, in his reply, did not at all seek to calm the fears of the usurper, but told his envoys that young Alexius had numerous partisans among the Crusaders, because he had made a promise to succor the Holy Land in person, and to put an end to the rebellion of the Greek Church. The Pope did not approve of the expedition against Constantinople. But, by speaking in the way he did, he thought that the sovereign who then reigned over Greece 73 might be induced to make the same promises as the fugitive prince, and would be more able to fulfill them. He conceived a hope that they might treat advantageously, without having recourse to the sword, and that the debates concerning the Empire of the East would be referred to a supreme tribunal. But the elder Alexius, whether he was persuaded that he had sufficiently interested the Pope in his cause, or whether he deemed it most prudent not to appear alarmed, or, in short, whether the prospect of a distant danger could not remove his habitual indolence, sent no more ambassadors, and made not the least exertion to prepare against the invasion of the warriors of the West. In another direction, the King of Jerusalem and the Christians of Palestine never ceased to give vent to their complaints, and to implore the assistance that the head of the Church had promised them. The Pope, much affected by their prayers, and always zealous for the crusade he had preached, renewed his efforts to direct the arms of the Crusaders against the Saracens. He sent the Cardinals, Peter of Capua, and Siegfried, into Palestine, as legates of the Holy See, to revive the courage of the Christians, and announce to them the approaching departure of the army of Crusaders. But when he learned that the leaders had determined upon attacking the Empire of Constantinople, he poured upon them the most bitter reprimands, and reproached them with looking behind them, as Lot's wife had done. "Let none among you," said he, "flatter himself that he may be allowed to invade or plunder the lands of the Greeks, under the pretense that the empire is not sufficiently submissive, or that the emperor has usurped the throne of his brother. Whatever crime he may have committed, it is not for you to constitute yourself a judge of it. You did not assume the cross to avenge the injuries of princes, but that of God." Innocent finished his letter without bestowing his benediction upon the Crusaders, and, to frighten them from their new enterprise, threatened them with the maledictions of heaven. The barons and knights received the remonstrances of the sovereign pontiff with respect, but did not at all waver in the resolution they had formed. Then the opponents of the expedition to Constantinople renewed their complaints, and employed no sort of moderation 74 in their discourses. The abbot of Fox-Tessernite, the abbot Martinus, one of the preachers of the crusade, the Count de Montfort, and a great number of knights employed every effort to shake the determination of the army. And when they found they could not succeed, resolved to leave them, some to return to their homes, and others to take the route to Palestine. Those who abandoned their colors, and those who remained in the camp, mutually accused each other with betraying the cause of Christ. 500 soldiers having thrown themselves on board a vessel, were shipwrecked and all swallowed up by the waves. Many others, in crossing Illyria, were massacred by the savage inhabitants of the country. These perished cursing the ambition and errors which had turned the Christian army aside from the true object of the crusade. Whilst those who remained faithful to their standards deplored the tragical death of their companions, saying among themselves, "The mercy of the Lord has remained with us." Evil be to them who stray from the way of the Lord. The knights and barons regretted in secret that they had not been able to obtain the approbation of the Pope, but were persuaded that, by means of victory, they should justify their conduct in the eyes of the Holy See, and that the Father of the Faithful would recognize in their conquests the expression of the will of heaven. The Crusaders were upon the point of embarking, when young Alexius himself arrived at Zara. His presence created a fresh enthusiasm for his cause. He was received amidst the sounds of trumpets and clarions, and presented to the army by the Marquis of Montferrat, 84, whose elder brothers had been connected by marriage and the dignity of Caesar with the imperial family of Constantinople. The baron hailed young Alexius as emperor, with the greater joy that they hoped his future grandeur would be the work 75 of their hands. Alexius took arms to break the chains of his father, and they admired in him a most touching model of Christian piety. He was about to combat usurpation, to punish injustice, and stifle heresy, and they looked upon him as an envoy of Providence. The misfortunes of princes destined to reign affect us more sensibly than those of other men. In the camp of the Crusaders, the soldiers talked over the story of Alexius among themselves, and they pitied his youth and deplored his exile and the captivity of Isaac. Alexius, accompanied by the princes and barons, went constantly among the soldiery, and replied by demonstrations of the warmest gratitude to the generous interest the Crusaders evinced in his favor. Animated by sentiments which misfortune inspires, and which not unfrequently terminate with it, the young prince was lavish of vows and protestations, and promised even more than he had done by his envoys, without thinking that he placed himself under the necessity of failing in his word, and drawing upon himself, one day, the reproaches of his liberators. The Crusaders, however, renewed every day their vow to place young Alexius on the throne of Constantinople, and Italy and the whole West rung with the fame of their preparations. The Emperor of Byzantium appeared to be the only person ignorant of the war declared against his usurped power, and slept upon the throne ready to crumble from under him. The Emperor Alexius, like the greater part of his predecessors, was a prince without virtues or character. When he deposed his brother, he allowed the crime to be committed by his courtiers, and when he was upon the throne he abandoned to them the charge of his authority. He was lavish of the treasures of the state, to secure pardon and oblivion for his usurpation. And, to repair his finances, he sold justice, ruined his subjects, and plundered the merchant ships that traded between Ramessa and Constantinople. The usurper scattered dignities and honors with such profusion, that no one thought himself honored by them, and there remained in his hands no true reward for merit. Alexius had associated his wife Euphrosyne with himself in this sovereign authority, and she filled the empire with her intrigues, and 76, scandalized the court by the laxity of her morals. Under his reign the empire had been several times menaced by the Bulgarians and the Turks. Alexius occasionally visited the army, but he never faced the enemy. Whilst the Bulgarians were ravaging his frontiers, he employed himself in leveling hills and tracing gardens on the shores of the Propontis. Abandoned to a shameful effeminacy, he disbanded a part of his army, and fearing to be disturbed in his pleasures by the din of arms, he sold the sacred vases, and plundered the tombs of the Greek emperors, to purchase peace of the Emperor of Germany, who had become master of Sicily. The empire had no navy left. The ministers had sold the rigging and equipments of the vessels, and the woods that might have furnished timber for new ships were reserved for the pleasures of the prince, and guarded as strictly, says Nicetas, as those formerly consecrated to the gods. 85. Such numbers of conspiracies never were heard of. Under an prince who was rarely visible, the government appeared to be in a state of interregnum. The imperial throne was as an empty seat, which every ambitious man aspired to occupy. Devotedness, probity, bravery, were no longer held in esteem by courtiers or citizens. Nothing was deemed worthy of public approbation or reward but the invention of a new pleasure or the fabrication of a fresh impost. Amidst this general depravity, the provinces knew nothing of the emperor but by the exaction of taxes. 86. And the army, without 77, discipline and without pay, had no leaders capable of commanding it. Everything announced an approaching revolution in the empire, and the peril was the greater from no one having the courage to foresee it. The subjects of Alexius never dreamed of obtruding truth upon the imperial ear. Birds, taught to repeat satires, alone interrupted the silence of the people, and published from the roofs of houses, and in the high streets, the scandals of the court and the disgrace of the empire. The Greeks, at the same time superstitious and corrupt, still preserved some remembrances of ancient Greece and old Rome. But these remembrances, instead of creating a noble, emulative pride, only nourished in their hearts a puerile vanity, and their history, of which they were so vain, only served to render more striking their own degradation and their empire's too evident decay. The voice of patriotism was never heard, and no influence was obeyed but that of the monks placed at the head of affairs of all kinds, who attracted and preserved the confidence of both people and prince by frivolous predictions and senseless visions. The Greeks wasted their time in vain disputes, which enervated their character, increased their ignorance, and stifled their patriotism. At the moment the fleet of the Crusaders was about to set sail, Constantinople was in a state of ferment with discussing the question whether the body of Jesus Christ, in the Eucharist, is corruptible or incorruptible. Each opinion had its partisans, whose defeats or triumphs were, by turns, loudly proclaimed, and the threatened empire remained without defenders. The Phoenicians and French left Zara, and the Isle of Corfu was appointed as the place of meeting for the whole fleet. 87. When they landed on the shores of Macedon, the inhabitants of Durrës brought young Alexis the keys of the city, and acknowledged him as their master. The people of Corfu 78 were not tardy in following this example, and received the Crusaders as liberators. The acclamations of the Greek people, in the passage of the Latins, was a happy augury for the success of their expedition. The island of Corfu, the country of the Phoenicians, so celebrated by the shipwreck of Ulysses and by the gardens of Alcinous, afforded the Crusaders pasturage and abundance of provisions. The fertility of the island induced the leaders to remain there several weeks. But so long a repose did not fail to produce evil consequences in an army supported by enthusiasm, to which no time for reflection should have been allowed, and, amidst indulgence and idleness, the complaints and murmurs of the siege of Zara broke out again. They learned that Gauthier de Brienne had conquered Apulia and the kingdom of Naples.
Did you just come on?
This conquest, effected in a
Are
few
you still
months
there?
by 60 knights, inflamed the imagination of the Crusaders, and furnished the malcontents with a fresh opportunity for blaming the expedition to Constantinople, the preparations for
Calling
which were
Firefox
immense, the perils
1811.
evident, and the success uncertain. "Whilst we are going," said they, "to exhaust the resources of the West in a useless enterprise, in a distant war, Gauthier de Brienne has made himself master of a rich kingdom, and is preparing to fulfill the promises he has entered into with us to deliver the Holy Land. Why should we not demand vessels of him? Why should we not set out for Palestine with him?" These speeches prevailed over a great number of the knights, who were ready to separate themselves from the army. The chief malcontents had already assembled in a secluded valley to deliberate upon the means of executing their project, when the leaders of the army were warned of their plot, and immediately united all their efforts to prevent the fatal consequences of it. The Doge of Venice, the Count of Flanders, the Counts of Blois and St. Paul, the Marquis of Montferrat, and several bishops clothed in mourning habits, with crosses borne before them, repaired to the valley in which the malcontents were met. As soon as they, from a distance, perceived their unfaithful companions, who were deliberating on horseback, they alighted, and advanced towards the place of assembly in a suppliant manner. The instigators of the desertion, seeing the leaders and prelates 79 of the army coming thus towards them, suspended their deliberations, and themselves dismounted from their horses. The parties approached each other. The princes, counts, and bishops threw themselves at the feet of the malcontents, and, bursting into tears, swore to remain thus prostrated till the warriors who wished to abandon them had renewed the oath to follow the army of the Christians, and to remain faithful to the standard of the Holy War. When the others saw, says Villehardouin, an ocular witness, when they saw their liege lords, their dearest relations and friends thus cast themselves at their feet, and, so to say, cried to them for mercy, they were moved with a great pity, and their hearts were so softened, they could not refrain from weeping, and they told them that they would consider of it together, Kyles Shinavisero and Par Ensemble. After having retired for a moment to deliberate, they came back to their leaders, and promised to remain with the army until the beginning of autumn, on condition that the barons and lords would swear upon the gospel to furnish them at that period with vessels to convey them to Syria. The two parties engaged themselves by oath to perform the conditions of the treaty, and returned together to the camp, where nothing now was spoken of but the expedition to Constantinople. The fleet of the Crusaders quitted the island of Corfu under the most happy auspices. The historians who have described its progress through that archipelago, so full of remembrances of antiquity, have not been able to refrain from employing the language of poetry. The wind was favorable, and the sky pure and serene. A profound calm reigned over the waves. 300 vessels of all sizes, with their colors floating from their sterns, covered an immense space.
Who would want
The
that?
helmets and cuirasses of 30,000
Oh.
warriors reflected the rays of the sun. Now were heard sounding over the
Another
waters the
ocean.
hymns of the priests, invoking the blessings of heaven. And then the voices of the soldiers, soothing the leisure of the voyage with warlike songs. And the braying of trumpets and neighing of horses, mingled with the dashing of oars, resounded from the coasts of the Peloponnesus, which presented themselves to the eyes of the pilgrims. The Crusaders doubled Cape Matapan, known formerly as Tanara, and passed before the heights of Melilla, 80, without dread of the rocks so much feared by ancient navigators. Near Cape Melilla they met two vessels returning from Palestine, in which were many Flemish pilgrims. At sight of the Venetian fleet, a soldier on board one of the two ships slipped down a rope and bade adieu to his companions, saying, "I leave you all I have on board, for I am going with people who intend to conquer kingdoms." 88. The Crusaders landed at several islands they fell in with on their passage. The inhabitants of Andros and Negropont came out to meet Alexius and acknowledged him as their emperor. It was a period of harvest, and the land presented, everywhere, a spectacle of the richest abundance. The enjoyment of a beautiful climate, the satisfaction at the submission of the Greeks, so many rich.
Alexius down, Alexius up. All right. There you go. The papal, the Holy See, Pappy, sent a letter. So y'all don't be doing that. Bit late. And they already laid that place waste. Too late. All right. I have got to go. It's been a good morning, and I appreciate you tuning in. And until next time, I will see you later. I'm gonna try to get on and do some music stream today. All right, so take care. I've got an hour and 10 minutes, so maybe I'll do an hour and 10 minutes music stream or more. Hey, all right, take care.